113 people were executed in Virginia. Frank Joseph Coppola, August 10, 1982, electrocution. He was a former Portsmouth police officer who became the first person executed in Virginia since 1962 and the first in the state after the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. Coppola was sentenced to death for the brutal April 22, 1978 robbery and murder of Muriel Hatchell. Coppola and three accomplices, his wife Karen, Joseph Miltier, and Donna Mills, conspired to rob the home of Muriel and her husband, Peyton Hatchell, a wealthy car dealer. After gaining entry under the guise of a flower delivery, they bound Muriel with Venetian blind cords. Coppola repeatedly slammed Muriel's head into the floor to force her to reveal where money was hidden. She died from brain hemorrhaging and asphyxiation. Her husband Peyton was also severely beaten, but he survived, though he required a permanent steel plate in his skull. The group fled with approximately $3,100 in cash and some jewelry. Coppola was identified as the ringleader, which led to his death sentence, while his accomplices received prison terms. His final meal consisted of an egg and cheese sandwich. He reportedly passed up the standard prison supper, jokingly asking for a wine recommendation instead. He maintained his innocence until the end, but volunteered for execution by dropping his appeals, stating he wanted to rescue any semblance of dignity he had left rather than face life in prison. His reported final words in the death chamber were spoken to a prison reformer who accompanied him. I love you. Please take care of my family, my children. His execution was noted for being botched. It required two 55-second jolts of electricity, during which his head and leg reportedly caught fire, filling the chamber with smoke. Linwood Earl Briley, October 12, 1984, electrocution. Briley was on death row as the ringleader of the notorious Briley Brothers, a sibling gang that terrorized Richmond during a brutal crime spree in 1979. He was linked to at least 11 to 12 murders. While he received multiple life sentences for various crimes, he was sentenced to death specifically for the capital murder of John Johnny G. Gallagher. He was 62 years old and a popular country western disc jockey. On September 14, 1979, the gang abducted him during a break outside a Richmond nightclub. They forced him into the trunk of his own car, drove him to a remote island, shot him in the head, and robbed him. When Linwood was arrested, he was still wearing a ring stolen from Gallagher's hand. Let's talk about the other victims. Orlin Christian, 57. In 1971, a 16-year-old Linwood shot his neighbor through a window while she was hanging laundry. He served only 1 year in a reformatory after claiming it was an accident. The Wilkerson family. The gang murdered Harvey Wilkerson, 27, his pregnant common-law wife Judy Barton, 23, and her 5-year-old son Harvey. Linwood essayed Judy Barton before the family was shot. The spree included the murders of Michael McDuffie, who was shot and robbed, Edric Alvin Clark, who was shot over a drug dispute, Mary Gowan, 76, beaten and killed, Christopher Phillips, 17, head crushed with a cinder block, and Mary Wilfong, 62, beaten to death with a baseball bat. In May 1984, Linwood and his brother James led the largest death row breakout in U.S. history. Along with 4 other inmates, they overpowered guards, staged a bomb hoax using a TV covered by a blanket, and drove out of the correctional center in a prison van. Linwood was recaptured 19 days later in Philadelphia while barbecuing chicken in a garage alley. He initially planned to skip his final meal, but prison officials provided him with steak and a baked potato. His final statement was a brief, repeated insistence on his innocence. I am innocent. I'm not guilty. His execution required two 55-second bursts of 2400 volts of electricity before he was pronounced dead. James Dyrrell Briley Jr., April 18, 1985, electrocution. He was on death row for his role in a brutal 7-month killing spree in Richmond, Virginia in 1979. He was executed by electric chair approximately 6 months after his older brother Linwood. While the Briley gang was linked to multiple murders, James received 2 death sentences specifically for the murders of a mother and child. Judy Diane Barton, 23. James essayed Barton, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, before shooting her 4 times in the head. Harvey Wayne Barton, 5 years old. James shot the young boy once in the head. Harvey Wilkerson, Barton's common-law husband. James was convicted of first-degree murder for his death, but because he was not the triggerman, accomplice Duncan Meekins admitted to this specific shooting. James received a life sentence rather than death for this victim. For his final meal, James ordered fried shrimp, a soft drink, and ice cream. In his final statement, James maintained his innocence, claiming he had been framed by another gang member. His last public statement was, "I am innocent and I was framed." His execution was marked by significant tension. Shortly before he was put to death, inmates at the Virginia State Penitentiary staged a violent riot involving the taking of hostages in an attempt to block the execution. One interesting thing about the siblings involved the triggerman rule. This rule was a unique legal provision in Virginia that stated only the actual perpetrator of a capital murder, the person who pulled the trigger, could be sentenced to death. The rule was the primary reason the youngest Briley brother, Anthony Briley, escaped the death penalty. While he participated in the gang's crime spree, he was not proven to be the triggerman in the specific killings that led to capital charges for his brothers. Anthony received a life sentence. Morris Odell Mason, June 25, 1985, electrocution. Known as the Killer of the Eastern Shore, his case was notably controversial due to his severe mental disabilities. He had an IQ of approximately 62 and a mental capacity of an 8-year-old. Mason's death sentence resulted from the brutal May 13, 1978 murder of an elderly woman during a 2-week crime spree. Margaret Kay Hand was 71 years old. Mason broke into her home, essayed her, and beat her with an axe handle. In a particularly gruesome act, he nailed her hand to a chair and tied her down before setting her house on fire, causing her to burn to death. 2 weeks before Hand's murder, Mason essayed Ursula Stevenson, 86, and set her house on fire as well. She also died in the blaze. The day after killing Hand, Mason attacked two sisters. He shot the 13-year-old, leaving her a paraplegic, and kidnapped the 12-year-old, whom he essayed and attempted to burn alive under a pile of leaves. Both girls survived. For his final meal, Mason ordered a massive spread from McDonald's: 4 Big Macs, 2 large orders of French fries, 2 hot fudge ice cream sundaes, an apple turnover pie, 2 large soft drinks, grape soda. Poignantly, Mason reportedly could not finish the sundaes and asked guards to put it in the freezer for tomorrow, illustrating his lack of comprehension that he would be dead by morning. Mason did not give a formal final statement in the death chamber. However, in his final hours, he spoke to various officials and supporters. To a legal advisor, he confusedly asked what he should wear to his own funeral. In a final interview, he expressed remorse. "I'd like to tell all of them that I'm sorry. If I hadn't been on drugs, it wouldn't have happened." To the warden just before the execution, he said, "I'm going to go out strong, just like I promised you." Michael Marnell Smith, July 31, 1986, electrocution. Smith was executed in Virginia's electric chair after spending nearly 9 years on death row. He was the first person condemned under Virginia's 1977 reinstated death penalty law. Smith was convicted of the capital murder and essay of Audrey Jean Whaler, 36, a divorced mother of 2. On May 23, 1977, Smith accosted Whaler while she was taking an early morning stroll along a beach near the Colonial Parkway in James City County. Smith initially helped her remove thorns from her feet before forcing her into the woods at knife point. He proceeded to essay, strangle, and stab her 3 times. He then dragged her to the river and held her head under water to ensure she was dead before abandoning the body in the water. Smith, a 40-year-old father of 3, had been recently released from prison for a prior essay conviction at the time of the murder. For his final meal, he requested a seafood feast. It included fried shrimp and fried oysters, clam cakes, cherry pie, and juice. He did not provide a formal final statement for the press or witnesses. However, witnesses reported that he prayed silently from the moment he was led into the execution chamber until the first surge of electricity hit him. During his final days, he spent most of his time reading a Bible, which he requested to have in his lap during the execution. The request was denied and the Bible was placed at his feet instead. His legal case, Smith versus Murray, eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, focusing on whether a prosecutor could use testimony from a court appointed psychiatrist who had interviewed the defendant without a full warning of his Fifth Amendment rights. Richard Lee Whitley, July 6, 1987, electrocution. He was executed for the brutal 1980 murder of his neighbor in Fairfax County. He was sentenced to death for killing Phoebe Parsons, 63, a widow who lived next door to him in the Pimmit Hills section of Fairfax. On July 25, 1980, Whitley visited Parsons under the guise of discussing his recent marital separation. During the visit, he choked her, tied a rope around her neck, and cut her throat with a Boy Scout pocket knife. Post-mortem, Whitley stripped her body and committed a vicious essay using two umbrellas. He ransacked her home for valuables, stole her credit cards and car keys, and fled the area in her 1978 Volkswagen. He was arrested a week later in Tampa, Florida. Prosecutors described him as a chronic career criminal with a history of violent offenses, including the essay of his stepdaughter and an assault on his own mother. Specific records regarding his final meal are not widely detailed in standard historical archives, though he spent his final days visited by his sister and legal counsel. He spent the morning of his execution listening to the hum of the electric chair being tested 35 feet from his cell, which he noted kind of makes you feel a little funny. Whitley chose to make no final statement in the death chamber. Prior to his execution, he told the TV station in a telephone interview that he was ready to die and expressed a desire for the execution to be televised without a hood so people could see his facial expressions. He was strapped into the chair by 7 guards and pronounced dead at 11:07 p.m. His case remains a notable part of Virginia's legal history as he was represented on appeal by a young Tim Kaine, who later became the governor of Virginia and a U.S. Senator. Earl Clanton Jr., April 14, 1988, electrocution. He was executed for the 1980 robbery and murder of a neighbor in Petersburg. He was notably the third escapee from the 1984 Mecklenburg death row breakout to be executed. Clanton was sentenced to death for the murder of Wilhelmina Smith, 38, an elementary school librarian. Clanton, who lived in the same apartment building as Smith, entered her home to rob her. He stabbed her multiple times and strangled her with a belt. Police found him shortly after the crime hiding under her bed in blood-soaked clothing. The robbery netted him only $8. Clanton had a violent criminal record starting at age 17 when he was convicted of participating in the murder of a neighbor in New Jersey during a robbery. He served 8 years of a 26 to 28-year sentence before being paroled. Following his move to Virginia, he was also convicted of malicious wounding for beating a teenager. In May 1984, Clanton was part of the group of 6 inmates who escaped from the correctional center. While the Briley brothers remained at large for 19 days, Clanton and another inmate were recaptured within 48 hours at a coin-operated laundry in North Carolina while drinking wine and eating cheese. Clanton refused the special final meal. Instead of the traditional requested feast, he spent his final day visiting with his mother, sister, and aunts. In his last day, he tallied his belongings, which included a chess set and a jean jacket, and bequeathed them to one of his lawyers. He had no final words in the death chamber. However, in a final interview with a Spanish TV crew, he expressed horror at the execution method, asking, "Why do you put a mask over my face when you murder me?" and stating that the public wasn't allowed to see the horror of the act. Alton Way, August 30, 1989, electrocution. He was executed for the brutal 1977 essay and murder of a widow in Lunenburg County. He was convicted for the October 14, 1977 killing of Laverne Marshall, who was 61 years old. Way broke into Marshall's home where he stabbed her 42 times with a butcher knife and beat her so severely that her face was unrecognizable. Post-mortem, he essayed her body and poured laundry bleach over her to attempt to destroy evidence. Shortly after the crime, Way called the police himself to report that he had killed a woman and later led authorities on a tour of the crime scene. His case later drew attention to his low IQ and claims that evidence regarding a potential accomplice had been suppressed, though his appeals were ultimately denied. Way refused the traditional final meal. Instead, he requested to take communion after being baptized the night before his execution. His final statement was recorded in secret by prison officials and only recently released to the public. His words were, "I would like to express that what is about to take place is a murder, and that I forgive the people who's involved in this murder, and that I don't hate nobody, and that I love them." He also requested that a message be sent to his family and supporters saying, "I am blessed." Way was the eighth person executed in Virginia since the reinstatement of capital punishment, and his execution required two 55-second jolts of electricity before he was pronounced dead. Richard Thomas Boggs, July 19, 1990, electrocution. Boggs was executed at the age of 27. He was the ninth person executed in the state. He was sentenced to death for the brutal January 25, 1984 murder and robbery of his elderly neighbor in Portsmouth, Virginia. Treby Shaw was 87 years old and a widow whom Boggs had known his entire life. On the night of the murder, Boggs went to her home under the pretext of borrowing a book. After she kindly invited him in and poured him a cup of tea, he beat her repeatedly with a metal bar, specifically a 4-inch piece of steel, and stabbed her with a butcher knife to ensure she was dead. Boggs confessed that he killed Shaw because he needed money to support a drug habit. He robbed her of diamond rings taken directly from her fingers and the family silver. Boggs was only caught after he was arrested on February 17, 1984 for a separate incident, a hit-and-run accident that killed a pedestrian. During the arrest, police discovered Shaw's stolen family silver in the trunk of his car. For his final meal, Richard Boggs requested raisin bagels and coffee. Officials noted that he appeared calm and quite resigned to his fate in his final hours, spending time with his parents, siblings, and prison chaplains. He had no final words. Witnesses noted that he walked slowly into the death chamber with his head tilted back and eyes closed, appearing to be in a state of deep meditation. He remained silent as he was strapped into the chair and remained so until the execution began at 11:02 p.m. His execution was the first carried out under the administration of Governor Douglas Wilder. His lawyers fought to the last minute, arguing that Boggs suffered from brain damage due to fetal alcohol syndrome and that the electric chair might malfunction, a fear based on a botched execution in Florida earlier that year, but all appeals for a stay were denied. Wilbert Lee Evans, October 17, 1990, electrocution. Evans was on death row for the capital murder of William Jean Truesdale, a 47-year-old deputy sheriff in Alexandria, Virginia. His case became one of the most controversial in Virginia's history due to claims of rehabilitation, prosecutorial misconduct, and the famously gruesome execution. On January 27, 1981, while being transported back to jail following a court hearing, Evans overpowered Deputy Truesdale and seized the officer's .38 caliber revolver. He shot Truesdale once in the chest and then used the gun to shoot off his own handcuffs. Evans was a fugitive for less than 30 minutes. During his flight, he attempted to shoot at two other officers, but the gun misfired. He was cornered in a parking lot 8 blocks away, where he shot himself in the stomach, but the wound was non-fatal. Deputy Truesdale died the following day during surgery. At the time of the murder, Evans was facing charges in North Carolina for assault, and he had a history of violent behavior, including a burglary that seriously injured a person and taking prison staff hostage at knife point in his youth. His case was unique because of his behavior while awaiting execution. During the largest death row breakout in U.S. history, led by the Briley brothers, Evans did not join the escapees. Instead, he and another inmate, Willie Lloyd Turner, protected 12 guards and 2 nurses from the rioting prisoners. One nurse testified that Evans directly stopped 2 inmates from molesting her. His lawyers argued that his heroic intervention proved Evans was no longer a future danger to society, a legal requirement for the death penalty in Virginia. However, Governor Douglas Wilder denied clemency, and Deputy Truesdale's widow publicly rejected the idea of Evans being a hero. According to prison officials, his final meal included pork, which they later bizarrely suggested may have contributed to his botched execution by causing hypertension. Evans did not make a formal final statement for the press. However, he carried a significant personal token into the chamber, a copy of Justice Thurgood Marshall's dissent in his case, which called the execution dead wrong. Evans wrote on the document, "Please bury this with me." Evans' death by electric chair is often cited as one of the worst in Virginia's history. When the first jolt of electricity was applied, blood began streaming from his eyes, mouth, and nose. Witnesses reported a sizzling sound and a pool of blood forming on the floor. Prison officials claimed the machine worked properly and that the bleeding was simply a nosebleed caused by high blood pressure or a poorly fitted mask. In 2023, secret audio recordings of the execution were released, where the narrator can be heard stammering as the bleeding began, though she never explicitly mentioned the blood on tape. Buddy Earl Justice, December 13, 1990, electrocution. He was executed at 37 years old. He was a spree killer who terrorized 3 states during a 4-day rampage in October 1978. Justice was convicted of essaying and murdering 3 women. He was unique at the time for being the only U.S. inmate under death sentences in 3 different states: Virginia, Georgia, and Florida. Let's talk about his victims. Ida Mae Moses, 21 years old, a nurse who was 8 months pregnant at the time of her death. On October 3, 1978, Justice broke into her trailer in Ironton, Virginia, where he essayed her and shot her 3 times in the head. Rosemary Jackson, 32, a housewife kidnapped while leaving a store in Atlanta, Georgia. Justice and an accomplice, Dale Goins, essayed and murdered her on October 5, 1978. Stephanie Hawkins, 21, a saleswoman kidnapped in Tampa, Florida, while preparing for her son's birthday party. Justice essayed and murdered her on October 6, 1978. Records state that Justice had a traumatic childhood characterized by severe physical abuse from his alcoholic father. He later married his adoptive mother, a highly dysfunctional relationship that ended when she sought a divorce. His spiritual advisor claimed the divorce triggered his crazy murderous spree. For his final meal, Justice requested steak, French fries, tossed salad, strawberry pie, and tea. He specifically requested a glass of wine, but this was denied by prison officials. Justice chose to make no formal final statement in the death chamber. However, he engaged in several final gestures. In a morning interview with a radio station, he apologized to the victims' families and criticized capital punishment as barbaric, asking that he be the last person executed. As he was strapped into the chair, he nodded to the sheriff who investigated the Moses case and smiled at the prison chaplain. His minister, Reverend Russ Ford, told him, "Be strong, you'll move on," to which Justice gave a slight smile. Justice was the last person executed at the original Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond before the facility closed and the electric chair was moved to the Greensville Correctional Center. Albert J. Cloza, July 24, 1991, electrocution. He was executed for the 1983 abduction, essay, and murder of Patricia Beth Patty Bolton, who was 13 years old, in Virginia Beach. Cloza was a maintenance worker at the trailer park where the victim lived. On January 13, 1983, he abducted Bolton as she walked home. He dragged her to a field where he subjected her to a 3-hour ordeal of essay, sodomy, and a despicable assault. Cloza beat the girl so severely that her upper lip was stripped from the bone and her jaw was dislocated. The medical examiner determined her cause of death was asphyxiation from inhaling her own blood due to the extensive facial injuries. He also used a 4-inch stick to puncture her private area and abdominal cavity. Her body was found the next day, nude except for one sock, at the bottom of an embankment. Cloza was arrested after police found his notebook and cigarettes at the scene, and the store clerk reported seeing him covered in blood. He did not request a special last meal. He instead accepted the standard prison dinner served that night, which consisted of chili and rice, peas, pasta salad, and chocolate cake. Cloza offered no final words in the death chamber, though he gave a thumbs-up sign to witnesses just before the execution began. Earlier, on the day of his execution, he issued a written statement expressing remorse. "I have never questioned my guilt or the punishment that the courts have given me. I only ask that if you find someone who needs help, do not turn a blind eye to them. Offer them a hand." The Virginia Supreme Court noted at the time that his case involved acts more despicable than any other in the state's records. Derrick Lynn Peterson, August 22, 1991, electrocution. He was executed for the 1982 robbery and murder of a grocery store manager in Hampton. His case is often remembered for a prolonged and difficult execution process. On February 7, 1982, Peterson entered the Pantry Pride supermarket office where the manager, Howard Kaufman, 45, was counting the day's receipts. Peterson grabbed several $1,000s in cash and checks and shot Kaufman once in the stomach. The man died from the wound. While on death row in 1984, Peterson was part of the Mecklenburg Six, the group of condemned inmates who carried out the largest death row breakout in U.S. history. He was recaptured the following day at a coin-operated laundry in North Carolina while eating wine and cheese. Peterson declined the special final meal. He chose instead to eat the standard prison fare served that Thursday evening: turkey and mashed potatoes, mixed vegetables, and cake. In the death chamber, he spoke for several minutes, focusing on racism and the justice system. We all know this chair was made of the same tree we once were hanged from. The blacks of the land need to speak up. The execution was notably botched. After the initial surge of electricity, a doctor checked Peterson and found he still had a pulse. The entire procedure had to be repeated, and he was finally pronounced dead at 11:13 p.m., roughly 13 minutes after the first jolt. His legal team argued for clemency until the final hours, citing his age at the time of the crime, 20, and claims of intellectual disability, but all stays were ultimately vacated by higher courts. Roger Keith Coleman, May 20, 1992, electrocution. He was executed for the 1981 essay and murder of his sister-in-law in Grundy, a coal mining town in Appalachia. Wanda Faye McCoy was 19 years old and the sister of Coleman's wife. She was a quiet housewife who was found by her husband Brad in their home with her throat slashed so deeply she was nearly beheaded. She had also been essayed and stabbed multiple times. Prosecutors argued Coleman was the killer because there was no sign of forced entry, suggesting McCoy knew her attacker. Physical evidence included a hair found on McCoy that was consistent with Coleman's, and bloodstains on his jeans that matched the victim's blood type. Coleman had a previous felony conviction for the attempted essay of a teacher in 1977. His case drew massive attention, including a Time magazine cover titled "Must This Man Die?" His appeals were famously blocked in federal courts because a court-appointed lawyer filed a crucial document one day late, a procedural error the U.S. Supreme Court ruled was enough to deny him a hearing on new evidence. On the morning of his execution, Governor Douglas Wilder granted him a last-minute lie detector test. Coleman failed the polygraph. Coleman shared his final meal with his chief advocate, James McCloskey of Centurion Ministries. He requested pepperoni pizza, chocolate ice cream, fudge cookies, and a 7-Up. He read his last words from a prepared statement while strapped into the electric chair. "An innocent man is going to be murdered tonight. When my innocence is proven, I hope America will realize the injustice of the death penalty, as all other civilized countries have. My last words are to the woman I love. Love is eternal. I love you, Sharon." 14 years after his execution, in 2006, Governor Mark Warner ordered the first ever posthumous DNA testing in a U.S. capital case. The DNA results definitively confirmed his guilt, revealing a 1 in 19 million chance that the genetic material found at the scene belonged to anyone other than Coleman. His longtime supporter, James McCloskey, stated he felt betrayed by the man he had spent 18 years trying to save. Edward Fitzgerald Sr., July 23, 1992, electrocution. Fitzgerald was convicted of the capital murder, essay, and robbery of Patricia Patsy Cubbage, 22, in November 1980, in a crime described by prosecutors as one of the most brutal in the state's history. Fitzgerald and an accomplice, Daniel Leroy Johnson, abducted Cubbage, a police informant, from a home in Chesterfield County. Fitzgerald repeatedly essayed and tortured her with a machete and a knife. An autopsy revealed she had been hacked and stabbed at least 184 times. In a particularly disturbing detail, Fitzgerald carved a tic-tac-toe pattern into her back while she was still alive. She eventually bled to death in a wooded area. The attack was reportedly fueled by Fitzgerald's rage because Cubbage had allegedly snitched on him regarding drug-related activities. Fitzgerald grew up in a household characterized by violence and abuse from his alcoholic father. He dropped out of school and became a member of a motorcycle gang in the Richmond area. Before the murder of Cabbage, he had already displayed extreme violence. In 1979, he shot and paralyzed his wife after finding her in bed with another man. For his last meal, he requested pizza and Pepsi. He had initially asked prison officials not to disclose his menu to the public, but the details were later shared by his biographer. Fitzgerald chose to have no final words in the death chamber. As he was strapped into the electric chair, he extended the first two fingers of each hand in a peace sign toward witnesses. In his last hours, he appeared resigned to his fate, telling his lawyers he did not want any long-shot last-minute appeals filed unless they were certain to work. Fitzgerald was the 15th person executed in Virginia since the reinstatement of capital punishment. Willie Leroy Jones, September 15, 1992, electrocution. He was executed at 34 years old. He was convicted of the capital murders of an elderly couple in Charles City County on May 13, 1983, Graham Atkins, 77, and Myra Atkins, 79. Jones, disguised and posing as an undercover police officer looking for missing children, gained entry to the home and shot Mr. Atkins in the face, killing him. After killing her husband, Jones bound and gagged Mrs. Atkins and stuffed her into a closet. He shot her in the head, doused her with kerosene, and set the house on fire. Although she had a gunshot wound, medical examiners determined she died of smoke inhalation. Jones targeted the couple because he was a friend of their stepson and knew they kept a large life savings, over $30,000, in cigar boxes and a small safe. After the murders, he went on a spending spree that took him as far as Hawaii, where he was eventually arrested. Jones was also one of the 6 inmates who participated in the May 1984 Mecklenburg death row breakout. He was recaptured in Vermont near the Canadian border after turning himself in because he was worried about his mother. According to reports from death penalty advocates who were with him, Jones shared part of his final meal with his chief advocate, Marie Deans, insisting she eat part of his potato to maintain her strength. Other records of his final meal requests are not as detailed as for other inmates, but his calm demeanor during the final hours was noted by witnesses. As he was strapped into the electric chair, Jones looked at the witnesses and spoke his final words, "I love you." Earlier that day, he had stated that he was prepared for his fate, but maintained that killing me is not the answer, suggesting that life in prison would have been a more appropriate resolution. Timothy Dale Bunch, December 10, 1992, electrocution. He was 33 years old when he was executed. He was a Marine sergeant at the time of the crime, and he was sentenced to death for a capital murder committed during a robbery. Let's talk about his victims. Sue Cha Thomas was 40 years old, a divorced woman who had developed an intimate relationship with Bunch while he was temporarily stationed at the U.S. Marine Corps based in Quantico. After meeting Thomas at her Dale City apartment for dinner on January 31, 1982, Bunch shot her in the head. In a ritualistic and gruesome act, he then used one of her scarves to hang her body from a doorknob. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was a combination of the gunshot wound and secondary asphyxiation by hanging. After the killing, Bunch spent approximately an hour in the apartment drinking wine and listening to the stereo. He then ransacked the home and stole a Rolex watch, a diamond ring, and other jewelry to make the crime appear as a random burglary. Bunch confessed that he killed Thomas because she was a slut who reminded him of his ex-wife. He also reportedly told investigators he experienced a during the killing, though he later repudiated this statement. Timothy Bunch chose to eat the standard prison meal served that day instead of requesting a special final meal. The meal consisted of turkey and mashed potatoes, mixed vegetables, and cake. Bunch gave an unusually long final statement that lasted nearly 6 minutes while strapped into the electric chair. He joked toward the end of his speech, saying, "To tell you the truth, I wanted this to be a filibuster, but I guess it's time for me to shut up. As Steve Martin said, comedy is not pretty." He expressed a desire for more dignity, requesting to be executed without the traditional death mask, stating, "I want you to have to look me in the face." He also used his final moments to thank the victim's family for forgiving him, adding that there was a lesson to be learned by all of us. His execution was briefly delayed by a legal challenge from another death row inmate, Sivaski Poiner, who sought to have the execution videotaped to prove the electric chair was cruel and unusual. However, the request was overturned minutes before the execution proceeded. Charles Sylvester Stamper, January 19, 1993, electrocution. He was executed for the murders of three co-workers during a restaurant robbery in 1978. His case gained national attention because he was a paraplegic at the time of his execution, making him the first wheelchair-using prisoner executed in the U.S. since capital punishment was reinstated. Stamper was a short-order cook at a Shoney's restaurant in Henrico County, Virginia. On the morning of March 25, 1978, he and an accomplice, Kernard Bowling, robbed the restaurant before it opened. Stephen Staples, the assistant manager, was forced into a walk-in freezer and shot in the chest at close range. His skull was also fractured with a heavy object. Agnes Hicks, a waitress, was shot twice and killed at the scene. Franklin Cooley, a janitor, was shot in the head and he was found alive, but he died in the hospital several hours later. Stamper stole approximately $4,000 from the restaurant's safe. He was caught due to circumstantial evidence, including glass shards in his car that matched the restaurant's broken front door and the discovery of one victim's car keys near his parents' home. He spent 14 years on death row, longer than any other Virginia inmate at that time. In 1988, he was attacked by a fellow inmate, resulting in a spinal cord injury that left him paralyzed from the waist down. Although he later learned to move short distances with leg braces and a walker, he spent his final years primarily in a wheelchair. According to prison records, Stamper requested and ate the standard prison dinner served that evening: turkey and mashed potatoes, mixed vegetables, and cake. Because of his disability, prison guards had to hold Stamper by the shoulders to help him walk the last few steps to the electric chair. Stamper did not speak in the chamber. Instead, he had the prison chaplain read a prepared statement. I think my execution today bruised and demeaned humanity. I hope my death would yield abundant fruit for others like myself. He was pronounced dead at 11:15 p.m. at the Greensville Correctional Center. His execution was a subject of intense debate, as opponents argued disabled man posed no future threat to society, while victim advocates and some disability groups insisted he should still pay the price for his crimes. Sivaski Lafayette Poiner, March 18, 1993, electrocution. Poiner was on death row for a violent 11-day crime spree in 1984, during which he robbed and murdered 5 women. He was executed by electric chair, becoming the 19th person executed in Virginia. Between January 23 and February 2, 1984, Poiner targeted women at random in the Hampton, Newport News, and Williamsburg areas of Virginia. He chose female victims because he believed they were easily frightened and easier to rob. He shot each of his victims once in the head at close range to avoid leaving witnesses, a tactic he reportedly learned from a fellow inmate during a previous prison stay. All 5 victims were robbed of small amounts of cash, typically $60 or less. Joyce Bolden was 45 years old and a hair salon manager in Hampton. She was shot in the head as she begged for her life. Clara Louise Paulette was 72 and a motel manager in Williamsburg. She was shot execution style during a robbery. Cheston Brooks was 43 and a housekeeper at the same Williamsburg motel. She was killed alongside Paulette. Vicky Ripple was 17 years old, a college student working at a Newport News ice cream parlor. She was shot while hiding in a corner. Carolyn Hedrick was 44 years old and a candy distributor in Hampton. She was abducted, essayed, and shot in her own car. Poiner's final meal consisted of fried chicken, rice and gravy, and green beans. He appeared calm during his execution. While he did not speak directly in the chamber, he had the chaplain read a prepared statement. Every hurt that has ever been done, heal that hurt. I choose to forgive, and I ask to be forgiven. In a separate statement released through his attorney, he added, I am sorry for all the hurt and pain and sorrows and suffering that I caused. Please forgive me. I am going home to be with Jesus. Poiner's final legal battle involved a failed class action lawsuit challenging the electric chair as unconstitutionally painful, a method he sought to have videotaped as evidence of its cruelty. Andrew Chabrol, June 17, 1993, electrocution. He was executed for the vengeful 1991 essay and murder of a female Navy colleague. He was notable for having the shortest time from crime to execution in Virginia's modern era, less than 2 years after he chose to waive his federal appeals. Chabrol, a former Navy lieutenant, committed a premeditated revenge murder against Petty Officer Second Class Melissa Harrington, 27. In 1990, while Harrington was in his command, she rejected Chabrol's romantic advances and filed a sexual harassment complaint against him. Chabrol blamed this complaint for ruining his marriage and stalling his career, and he began referring to her as Nemesis in a computer journal where he detailed plans for revenge. On July 9, 1991, after tracking her home, Chabrol and an accomplice, Stanley Berkeley, abducted Harrington as she left for work. They took her to Chabrol's home, where she was strapped to a bed and repeatedly essayed. When Harrington attempted to fight back, Chabrol manually strangled her, then wrapped her face in duct tape, tied a rope around her neck, and placed a plastic bag over her head to ensure she suffocated. He testified that he just went berserk during the killing. His accomplice, Stanley Berkeley, was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms for first-degree murder, essay, and abduction, but avoided the death penalty because he was not the triggerman, aka the primary killer. According to reports from the Clark County Prosecuting Attorney's database for similar Virginia executions, many inmates like Chabrol chose the standard prison meal or kept their requests private. Official archives for Chabrol specifically indicate he was pronounced dead shortly after his final hours, during which he showed little expression and appeared resigned. He had no final words. Witnesses noted that he entered the death chamber with an emotionless expression, as though it were just another trip, and remained completely silent as he was being strapped into the electric chair. Chabrol's case returned to the news decades later due to a controversial burial. Because he had been honorably discharged from the Navy before his crimes, he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery in 1993. Following public outcry and new legislation in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, his remains were ordered to be disinterred and removed from that cemetery. Joe Louis Wise Sr., September 14, 1993, electrocution. He was executed for the brutal robbery and murder of a correctional center maintenance worker nearly a decade earlier. In December 1983, he killed William Ricketson, 43, after luring him to a remote location under the guise of selling him a tractor. He then bludgeoned Ricketson, shot him in the eye and chest, and dumped his body into a shallow water-filled privy hole that had been dug for a factory toilet. Although the beating and gunshot wounds were severe, an autopsy revealed that Ricketson ultimately drowned in the water, mud, and waste inside the hole, where Wise had buried him under cinder blocks. Following the murder, Wise stole Ricketson's pickup truck. He was arrested later that day while attempting to put oil in the stolen vehicle. Wise refused the traditional final meal. He spent his last hours visiting with his family and spiritual advisor. He made no formal final statement in the death chamber. He was reported to be calm and resigned in his final moments. He was pronounced dead at 11:12 p.m. at the Greensville Correctional Center. Wise had requested clemency from Governor Douglas Wilder, arguing that his original court-appointed lawyer was inexperienced and had failed to present evidence of his deprived and abusive childhood. Wilder denied the petition, stating there was no information to prompt his intervention. David Mark Pruitt, December 16, 1993, electrocution. He was executed for the 1985 essay and murder of his best friend's wife. He spent nearly 8 years on death row at the Greensville Correctional Center before his sentence was carried out. Pruitt was a convicted killer responsible for at least 2 murders in Virginia Beach. On February 12, 1985, he entered the home of Wilma Harvey while her husband Richard, who was Pruitt's best friend and had given him a job as a cook, was away on business. Pruitt essayed and stabbed her to death, and her body was found bound and nude on her bed with multiple stab wounds. Wilma Harvey was 35 years old. Upon his arrest for Harvey's murder, Pruitt confessed to the 1975 slaying of Deborah McInnes, a former co-worker at a Kentucky Fried Chicken. He had stabbed, beaten, and cut her throat. He received a life sentence for this crime 4 months after his death sentence for the Harvey murder. According to reports from the Washington Post, Pruitt declined a special final meal. He instead ate the standard prison dinner served to all inmates that evening. David Mark Pruitt also elected not to make a final statement. Witnesses noted that he was extremely stoic during the process, keeping his eyes cast downward and refusing to look at anyone while being strapped into the chair and having the death mask applied. He was pronounced dead at 11:11 p.m. Governor Wilder denied clemency after showing a photograph of the victim's slashed throat to reporters, stating that the sheer vileness of the crime outweighed pleas regarding Pruitt's psychological problems. Johnny Watkins Jr., March 3, 1994, electrocution. He was executed for a pair of convenience store robberies and murders committed in November 1983 in Danville. His execution was historically significant as the 259th and final electrocution in Virginia before the state transitioned to lethal injection as the primary method. Watkins carried out two separate robberies just 8 days apart, netting less than $125 in total. On November 14, 1983, Watkins shot and killed Betty Jean Barker, 22, a clerk at the Quick Stop Market, stealing approximately $90. On November 22, 1983, Watkins shot and killed Carl Douglas Buchanan, 41, at a fast fare convenience store, stealing about $35. In both murders, Watkins used the same .22 caliber pistol and shot each victim 4 times. He was identified after his brother Darnell used the stolen $2 bill from the second robbery, the serial number of which had been recorded, at a local clothing store. Watkins and his attorneys spent his final years arguing that his sentencing was tainted by racism, noting that at the time no white man had been sentenced to death in Danville. His appeals reached the U.S. Supreme Court, where Justice Thurgood Marshall famously dissented, arguing that Watkins' Fifth Amendment right to counsel had been violated during police interrogations. Governor George Allen ultimately denied his petition for clemency. Watkins requested and ate a standard prison dinner consisting of turkey, mashed potatoes, mixed vegetables, and cake. He made no formal final statement in the execution chamber. However, 2 days before his death, he told a reporter, "I've made peace and I'm about as ready as I'm going to get, I expect." Timothy Wilson Spencer, April 27, 1994, electrocution. Spencer, infamously known as the Southside Strangler, was on death row in Virginia for a series of essays and murders committed in late 1987. He is historically significant as the first serial killer in the U.S. to be convicted on the basis of DNA evidence, a technology that also led to the exoneration of David Vasquez, who had been wrongfully convicted for one of Spencer's earlier crimes. Spencer was linked to at least 5 murders and 9 essays between 1984 and 1988. He would typically enter victims' homes through windows at night, then bind, essay, and strangle them using ligatures such as belts, stockings, or rope. His known murder victims included Carolyn Ham, 32, murdered in January 1984 in Arlington. Though DNA later linked Spencer to this crime, he was never formally charged for it because he was already facing multiple death sentences. Debbie Dudley Davis, 35, an account executive murdered in her Richmond apartment in September 1987. Dr. Susan Helms, 32, a neurosurgery resident murdered in her Richmond home in October 1987. Diane Cho, 15, a high school student murdered in her Chesterfield County apartment in November 1987. She was found with an infinity symbol painted on her hip with nail polish. Susan Tucker, 44, an editor murdered in her Arlington condominium in late November 1987. For his final meal, Spencer requested fried chicken, French fries, and a soft drink. When the warden asked if he had any final statement, Spencer replied, "Yeah, I think." He then fell silent, looking around for about 20 seconds, and simply nodded before the death mask was applied. He remained stoic throughout the process, showing no visible emotion. He was pronounced dead at 11:13 p.m. His case remains a landmark in forensic history. Dana Ray Edmonds, January 24, 1995, lethal injection. He is historically significant as the first person in Virginia to be executed by lethal injection. Edmonds was sentenced to death for the 1983 robbery and murder of John Elliott, 62. On July 22, 1983, Edmonds entered Elliott's small grocery store in Danville. He first gagged Elliott, bashed his head with a brick, and then cut his throat with a knife. Elliott was left behind the counter to bleed to death, a process medical examiners estimated took several minutes. Edmonds stole approximately $40 from the cash register before fleeing. During his trial, Edmonds claimed he acted in self-defense after Elliott allegedly pulled a gun on him during a dispute over missing watches. However, the court found the evidence favored a premeditated robbery and murder. Edmonds declined a traditional final meal. When the head cook asked him 3 times for his request, Edmonds stated that food was not important to him. He instead asked that the cook prepare a meal for the officers assigned to guard him in the death house. His last words were spoken in a garbled near whisper, just as the lethal chemicals began to flow. Witnesses reported he spoke about forgiveness for those he was leaving behind. His final audible words were, "I'm okay, don't worry about me." His execution marked the end of an 87-year tradition in Virginia where executions were held at 11 p.m. Officials moved his execution to 9 p.m. to reduce staff stress and prison disruption. Willie Lloyd Turner, May 26, 1995, lethal injection. Turner was executed after spending 15 years on death row, at the time the longest tenure of any inmate in the state's modern history. Turner was sentenced to death for the July 12, 1978 murder of Jack Smith, 54, a jewelry store owner in Franklin, Virginia. Turner entered the store armed with a sawed-off shotgun to commit a robbery. During the crime, he took a police officer's revolver and shot Smith in the head after learning Smith had triggered a silent alarm. As Smith lay helpless and gurgling on the floor, Turner leaned over the counter and fired 2 more fatal shots into his chest. Turner was a lifelong criminal with a history of violent offenses, including an earlier murder committed while in prison during the 1970s. His final meal request included fried chicken, French fries, and a soft drink. He had spent years on death row fighting his sentence. Once he even came within 5 hours of execution. He also chose a last meal, but then he was given a stay. In the death chamber, Turner spoke to his attorney, Walter Walvick, saying, "I love you, man." He also asked about the procedure as it began, questioning, "When is it going to start? Will I feel it?" However, the most significant last word was a cryptic instruction he left for his lawyer: "Look in the typewriter." Turner had spent years using a Smith Corona typewriter to draft legal appeals and a 473-page manuscript. After the execution, Walvick opened the machine's casing and found a loaded .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, a plastic bag of extra bullets, and 2 saw blades, a handwritten note that simply said, "Smile." The discovery humiliated the Virginia Department of Corrections, as the gun had been smuggled past security and hidden under their noses for years. Dennis Walden Stockton, September 27, 1995, lethal injection. Stockton was executed for the 1978 murder for hire of a teenager. Known as the Dean of Virginia's death row, he spent over 12 years fighting his conviction while maintaining his innocence. Stockton was convicted of the capital murder of Kenneth Wayne Arnder, 18, in July 1978. Arnder was shot in the head and his hands were hacked off at the wrists, a signature often associated with drug-related retribution. His decomposed body was found 5 days after he was last seen with Stockton. Prosecutors argued Stockton killed him for $1,500 at the request of Tommy McBride, who allegedly wanted Arnder dead following a sword drug deal. During his sentencing, witnesses testified that Stockton had also killed another man, Ronnie Tate, in 1979 to silence him about the Arnder murder. Stockton claimed he killed Tate in self-defense. For his final meal, he requested and ate grilled cheese and French fries. He was reported to be upbeat during the meal, even comforting a teary-eyed minister by telling him, "I want you to be strong." Stockton did not give a spoken final statement in the death chamber. Instead, he let one of his fictional characters, Danny Revels, speak for him in a final written statement. Dennis is a victim of a crime in the worst kind of way. May God not hold the feelings of his enemies toward him against them. Stockton gained notoriety for keeping a detailed daily diary that was published in the Virginian Pilot. His writings provided inside information about the 1984 Mecklenburg escape, leading to threats from other inmates for naming names. His conviction relied almost entirely on the testimony of Randy Bauman, who later recanted to a reporter, claiming he never heard Stockton take the hit before later reaffirming his original story. Mikey Wayne Davidson, October 19, 1995, lethal injection. He was the 28th person executed in Virginia since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Davidson, a construction worker from Southville, Virginia, committed a triple homicide on June 13, 1990. He confessed to bludgeoning his family to death with a crowbar. His victims were Doris Jane Davidson, 36, his wife, Mamie Darnell Clatterbuck, 14, his stepdaughter, and Tammy Lynn Clatterbuck, 13, also his stepdaughter. Davidson stated in his confession that he killed them because his wife was packing to leave him and return to her first husband with the girls. A neighbor reported that the victims were planning to leave the day after, seeking child support. Davidson's time on death row was marked by frequent changes of heart regarding his appeals. He repeatedly alternated between wanting to proceed with his execution and seeking to fight his sentence. He ultimately signed a statement to Governor George Allen asking for the execution to proceed, saying he deserved to die. His cousin, Barry Davidson, filed last-minute appeals arguing that Mikey was mentally incompetent to waive his rights and that he suffered from severe alcoholism at the time of the murders. These were rejected by federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court, as they should. In anticipation of his death, Davidson purchased a burial plot for himself in a Saltville cemetery next to where his victims were buried. There are no records of his last meal. He was described as pensive and sad in his final hours, but resigned to the process. His final statement in the death chamber was a short religious statement. "I'll say my last words to the Lord. I guess that's all that really needs to be said." Witnesses noted he appeared very calm and had reportedly made his peace with God. Herman Charles Barnes, November 13, 1995, lethal injection. He was 31 years old when he was executed. Barnes was sentenced to death for a double homicide committed during an attempted robbery on June 27, 1985, at the Bond supermarket in Hampton, Virginia. Barnes entered the store wearing a nylon stocking mask and used the supermarket employee, Ricky Adams, as a human shield at gunpoint to gain entry after hours. He killed Clyde Jenkins, 72. He was the store's owner. Jenkins confronted Barnes and a struggle ensued. Barnes shot Jenkins twice at point-blank range. As Jenkins struggled to rise from the floor, Barnes shot him a third time in the neck, paralyzing him. Jenkins survived for 13 days before dying in the hospital from his wounds. Barnes also killed Mohammed Afifi, 42. He was a store clerk who had immigrated from Jerusalem. Afifi rushed from the back of the store and jumped on Barnes's back to help Jenkins. Barnes shook him off and fatally shot him in the chest. Barnes's case drew significant attention during the appeals process because a federal judge initially overturned his death sentence in 1994. The judge ruled that prosecutors had suppressed evidence, specifically a gun found unfired under Jenkins' body. Barnes' attorneys argued this information could have helped them present a defense that Barnes was confronted by an armed man, potentially mitigating the severity of the sentence. However, the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals later reinstated the death penalty, ruling that the evidence would not have changed the outcome. Specific public records regarding a unique last meal request for Herman Charles Barnes are not detailed in historical archives. On the day of his execution, he was visited by relatives. As the lethal chemicals were being administered, Barnes spoke his final words, "Thank you, Jesus." He was pronounced dead at 10:11 p.m. Walter Milton Correll Jr., January 4, 1996, lethal injection. He was on death row for the brutal abduction, robbery, and murder of a 24-year-old man in August 1985. On August 11, 1985, Correll and two teenage accomplices, Richard Edwin Reynolds and John Marshall Dalton, decided to steal a car in Roanoke. They targeted Charles Bausman Jr., choked him into unconsciousness, and stuffed him into the trunk of his own car. The group drove to a wooded area in Franklin County. According to court records and accomplice testimony, Correll took a hunting knife found in the car and threw it into Bausman's chest twice. Another accomplice then used the knife to slit Bousman's throat. Correll was arrested several days later and eventually confessed to the murder during interrogation, though he later tried to retract it, claiming he had been denied a lawyer. Correll's case was controversial because he had an IQ of 68, placing him on the borderline of intellectual disability. His lawyers argued that he was a follower rather than the leader of the group, but prosecutors maintained he played the lead role in the killing. In 1994, a U.S. district judge overturned his conviction, ruling that his right to counsel had been violated. However, the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals reinstated the sentence, concluding that the outcome of the trial would have been the same even without the contested confession. While on death row, Correll reportedly converted to Catholicism and became a born-again Christian, which his mother claimed changed his character significantly. There are no records of his last meal. In the hours before his execution, he met with clergy. He also did not have a final statement in the death chamber. He was the 30th person executed in Virginia since the reinstatement of capital punishment. Richard Towns Jr., January 23, 1996, lethal injection. Towns was sentenced to death for the 1985 execution-style slaying of a convenience store clerk in Virginia Beach. Virginia Goebel was 32 years old and the mother of two, working the night shift at the Gulf Magic Market. On April 14, 1985, Towns robbed the store of approximately $186. To prevent Goebel from identifying him, Towns shot her in the head with a .45 caliber handgun. At the time of his trial, Towns had an extensive criminal history, including 29 prior felony convictions, such as a 1976 incident where he held a taxi driver hostage before shooting him in the back. Towns famously represented himself at his 1986 trial after dismissing his court-appointed lawyers to protest the low pay for indigent defense. During the sentencing phase, he presented no mitigating evidence and did not address the jury. Years later, two jurors signed affidavits stating they would have voted for life instead of death if they had known he was ineligible for parole. According to prison records, Richard Towns Jr. declined the special final meal. He chose instead to eat the standard prison dinner served that night. While being strapped to the gurney, Towns whispered his final statement to the warden. "I'm innocent. That's all I have to say. I'm innocent." His execution was delayed for 22 minutes because medical personnel struggled to find a suitable vein for the needles. After failed attempts in his arms, the lethal drugs were eventually injected into the top of his right foot. Joseph John Savino III, July 17, 1996, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for the November 29, 1988 robbery and murder of his domestic partner, Thomas McWatters Jr., 64. Savino bludgeoned McWatters with a hammer while he was sleeping at the farm home they shared in Bedford County. When he realized McWatters was still breathing, Savino stabbed him several times in the neck and back. Following the killing, Savino robbed McWatters to obtain more cocaine. He had worked for McWatters' construction firm and moved in with him after being paroled from a New York prison. He later claimed the relationship was abusive and that McWatters had used money and his parole status to control him and demand relations. Savino spent over 7 years on death row. He famously volunteered for execution multiple times, even requesting that his execution be televised and that Dr. Jack Kevorkian be allowed to harvest his organs for donation. He repeatedly changed his mind, filing and then withdrawing appeals. While incarcerated, Savino reportedly attempted to take his own life by cocaine and heroin overdose after smuggling drugs into his cell. His defense argued he was suffering from cocaine psychosis at the time of the crime. He ultimately pled guilty to capital murder. There are no records of his last meal. In his final hours, he received Holy Communion from Bishop Walter Sullivan, which he described as very comforting. As he lay on the execution gurney, Savino spoke calmly to the witnesses. "I'm sorry for what happened to Tommy McWatters. I did not kill McWatters. I'm sorry. The Commonwealth has chosen to punish my family. I hope my family and friends know I love them. I will finally be at peace." His execution was briefly delayed for 2 hours while the U.S. Supreme Court reviewed the final last-minute appeal. Ronald Bennett, November 21, 1996, lethal injection. He was 42 years old and had been on death row since his 1987 conviction. Bennett was sentenced to death for the 1985 capital murder and robbery of Anne Elizabeth Vicky Vaden, 28, a real estate agent in Chesterfield County, Virginia. On November 16, 1985, Bennett broke into Vaden's apartment. He bound her, beat her, choked her, and stabbed her to death. The crime was considered especially heinous due to its vileness, a legal standard in Virginia. Bennett stole a suitcase and jewelry, including a ring belonging to Vaden. The case went unsolved for a year until Bennett's ex-wife, Mary Bennett, drunkenly mentioned to a friend in California that her ring belonged to a murdered woman. The friend contacted police, leading to Bennett's arrest. His execution was controversial because the primary evidence against him came from his ex-wife and a cousin. His ex-wife claimed she was a witness to the murder and lied to protect herself. Governor George Allen denied his petition for clemency, and the U.S. Supreme Court also refused to stay the execution. There are no records of his last meal. He was described as having a heavy-set and bearded appearance during the final proceedings. He chose to say nothing in the death chamber. When the warden asked if he had any final statement, he simply replied no. He went silently to his death, appearing inert on the gurney as the lethal chemicals were administered. He was pronounced dead at 9:19 p.m. Gregory Warren Beaver, December 4, 1996, lethal injection. Beaver's death sentence resulted from the April 12, 1985 killing of Virginia State Trooper Leo Witt, 48. Beaver, who was 20 at the time, had escaped from a drug treatment program in Maryland and was driving a stolen car back from Florida. Trooper Witt pulled him over for a routine traffic stop on Interstate 95 in Prince George County. According to a hitchhiker who was a passenger in Beaver's car, Witt asked for license and registration and then moved to the front of the vehicle to note the license plate. As the trooper returned to the driver's side window, Beaver shot him once in the neck and once in the face. He then fled, but he was caught shortly after at a fast food restaurant near Richmond after the hitchhiker alerted an employee to call the police. Beaver's legal battle lasted 11 years. His defense raised a significant issue regarding a conflict of interest, noting that one of his court-appointed attorneys was a part-time prosecutor in a neighboring county. However, the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that no actual conflict had been proven, and the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final petition for a stay just hours before the execution. There are no records of his last meal. He also didn't have any final words. He remained silent as he was prepared for the execution, and he was pronounced dead at 9:15 p.m. at the Greensville Correctional Center. Larry Allen Stout, December 10, 1996, lethal injection. He spent 9 years on death row for a fatal robbery committed in Staunton, Virginia. Stout was sentenced to death for the February 19, 1987 murder of Jacqueline Cushion, 40, the owner of a dry cleaning establishment called Trimble's Cleaners. Stout entered the shop near closing time, posing as a customer picking up clothes. When Cushion turned her back, he grabbed her by the hair and slashed her throat with a 5-inch folding buck knife. He fled with approximately $1,200 from the business. Cushion was a mother of 2 children. She managed to run into the street for help while clutching her bleeding throat, but died en route to the hospital. Stout's case was legally notable because he pleaded guilty to capital murder on the advice of his public defender. He later argued he received poor legal help, claiming his lawyer promised that a guilty plea would ensure he avoided the death penalty. During his sentencing, Stout testified the killing was an accident. He claimed that when Cushion grabbed his arm, he shoved her and she was accidentally cut during the struggle. However, a pathologist testified that the depth of the wound, 2 inches, and its location suggested a deliberate attack from behind. A federal judge initially ordered a new sentencing in 1994 based on the ineffective counsel claim, but the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals reversed this, ruling that the lawyer's decision to present no evidence was a conscious and strategic choice. There are no records of his last meal. On his final day, he met with his minister and lawyers and made several phone calls to friends to say goodbye. Larry Allen Stout used his final statement to offer an apology to the victim's family and speak to his own loved ones. "I'm sorry to the family for the pain I have caused. I hope this closes the chapter on this. To my wife, I love you. Sunshine, I love you. Be tough." The execution took place on International Human Rights Day, which prompted protests from death penalty opponents on the Virginia state capitol grounds. Lem Davis Tuggle Jr., December 12, 1996, lethal injection. He was on death row for the brutal essay and murder of Jesse Geneva Havens in 1983. He was the final surviving participant of the historic 1984 Mecklenburg Correctional Center escape to be executed. Tuggle's criminal history was marked by repeated violence against women occurring shortly after periods of freedom. Shirley Mullins Brickey, 17. In 1971, Tuggle choked a teenager to death after meeting her at a dance in Smith County. He was sentenced to 20 years for second-degree murder, but he was paroled in 1983 after serving 11 years. Jesse Geneva Havens, 52. Just 4 months after his parole, Tuggle met Havens at another dance in the same hometown. He lured her away, then essayed, sodomized, and shot her once in the chest with a .25 caliber handgun. He then robbed a nearby gas station and later led authorities to her body. Tuggle gained national infamy for his role in the May 1984 death row breakout, which was the largest in U.S. history. He and 5 other inmates used homemade knives and a fake bomb to overpower 13 prison employees before escaping in a prison van. He was recaptured 9 days later in Vermont after telling a state trooper, "I'm Lem, and I'm wanted in Virginia." He attempted 2 more unsuccessful escapes in 1985 and then again in 1987. To preserve his privacy, Tuggle initially requested that his last meal not be revealed to the public. The following year, corrections officials disclosed it consisted of pizza, tossed salad with ranch dressing. Just before the lethal chemicals were administered, Tuggle, who had a Born to Die tattoo on his arm, spoke his final words in a barely audible voice. He only said, "Merry Christmas." His execution was a landmark case regarding the right of indigent defendants to state-paid psychiatric assistance, Tuggle versus Netherlands, a legal battle that delayed his execution for over a decade. Ronald Lee Hoke, December 16, 1996, lethal injection. Hoke was sentenced to death for the October 4, 1985 essay, robbery, and murder of Virginia Stell, 56, in Petersburg, Virginia. Hoke met Stell at a bar just hours after he had been released from a state mental hospital. After going to her apartment, an argument broke out. Hoke bound Stell's wrists and ankles with electrical cords, he gagged her with her own underwear, and stabbed her multiple times in the back and stomach with a kitchen knife. He ransacked her apartment and stole medication from her purse. Hoke turned himself in to police in Hagerstown, Maryland, roughly 10 days later and confessed 3 times to the killing. He had a 10-year criminal history involving assault, burglary, and attempted arson. On the day of the murder, he had been discharged from a Petersburg mental hospital where he had been a voluntary patient for a week. He was given a bus ticket to Maryland and anti-anxiety medication, but he cashed the ticket, bought alcohol, and began drinking before meeting Stell. According to reports from the Roanoke Times and official records, Ronald Lee Hoke Sr. declined a special final meal. He spent his final hours with his legal counsel and spiritual advisors. As he lay on the execution gurney, Hoke offered a final statement of remorse. "I know I have caused a lot of pain to the victim's family. I hope one day they can forgive me. I love you too." His execution took place despite last-minute appeals focused on his mental health. Michael Carl George, February 6, 1997, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for the 1990 robbery, essay, and murder of a teenager, a crime that shocked Virginia for its extreme vileness. George's criminal history involved multiple young victims. Alexander Eugene Stanko, 15. On June 16, 1990, George abducted Stanko as the boy was riding his dirt bike near a power line trail in Woodbridge. George handcuffed the teenager to a tree and subjected him to horrific torture, which included using a stun gun to apply electrical shocks to the boy's private area and sodomizing him. He ultimately shot Stanko once in the head with a 9mm pistol to stop his screaming. George also robbed the victim of his helmet, wallet, and shoes. Larry Wayne Perry, 9. In 1979, George was involved in the disappearance of Perry from Dumfries, Virginia. George originally claimed the boy accidentally shot himself while they were target shooting. He then panicked and buried the body in a ravine. Because Perry's body was never found, George was allowed to plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter and served only 2.5 years of a 5-year sentence. After his arrest for Stanko's murder, George reportedly confessed to a third killing involving a victim he allegedly picked up from a McDonald's in Woodbridge within the previous decade. However, this claim could never be verified by authorities. George declined the special final meal. He instead spent his final hours with his mother, father, and 3 brothers. He offered no final statement in the death chamber. While he was silent on the gurney, he had given a written statement to his minister, which was not released to the press, and wrote a 1-page letter to the Stanko family asking for their forgiveness. He was pronounced dead at 9:18 p.m. The execution proceeded just hours after his final pleas were denied by the U.S. Supreme Court, where Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and John Paul Stevens had voted for a stay. Coleman Wayne Gray, February 26, 1997, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for a 1985 abduction, robbery, and murder. His case was highly controversial due to the prosecution's use of uncharged ambush evidence during the sentencing phase. The victim was Richard McClelland, 41 years old. He was a popular manager at a Murphy's Mart store in Portsmouth. On May 2, 1985, Gray and an accomplice, Melvin Tucker, forced McClelland off the road as he drove home from work. They coerced him into returning to his store and opening the safe, stealing approximately $12,000. After the robbery, Gray drove McClelland to a remote road near Tidewater Community College, and despite McClelland's desperate pleas to spare him for the sake of his wife and children, Gray ordered him to lie face down and shot him 6 times in the back of the head. Gray then set the victim's car on fire to destroy evidence. The most significant aspect of Gray's case was the introduction of uncharged crimes during his sentencing. The prosecutor introduced graphic photos and testimony linking Gray to the 1984 murders of Lisa Sorrell and her 3-year-old daughter Shanta, who were shot and burned in a car in a manner similar to McClelland. Gray was never charged with these crimes, and his defense was notified only the night before the hearing that forensic evidence and not just hearsay statements would be used. A federal judge initially threw out the death sentence, calling the tactic fundamentally and irreparably unfair. However, the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals reinstated it, a decision eventually upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in Gray v. Netherlands. There are no records of his last meal. He was visited by his mother and sister on the day of his death. Gray made no final statement in the death chamber. When given the opportunity to speak, he simply stated, "I have no last statement." He was pronounced dead at 9:04 p.m. at the Greensville Correctional Center. Roy Bruce Smith, July 17, 1997, lethal injection. The death sentence resulted from the slaying of Manassas City Police Sergeant John Connor. On July 24, 1988, after an ongoing dispute with his wife and consuming large amounts of beer, Smith armed himself and he began firing the rifle into the air from his front stoop, reportedly telling neighbors, "Wait till I start shooting people," and stating he hoped the police would arrive so he could shoot the first one who showed up. Sergeant Connor responded to the call and was monitoring the rear of Smith's townhouse. When Connor ordered Smith to drop his rifle, Smith opened fire. Connor was shot multiple times in the leg, arm, back, and head. The fatal head wound was inflicted at close range, within 3 to 6 feet, and resulted in a significant portion of his skull being missing. Smith struggled with multiple officers after his rifle jammed. Even after being subdued, he reportedly told officers to go ahead and kill him. Smith requested a highly unusual final meal consisting of grape juice with Epsom salts and unleavened bread. After eating, he reportedly thanked prison officials for the meal. Roy Bruce Smith's final moments were marked by religious and philosophical focus. As he was strapped to the gurney, he was heard muttering an unintelligible prayer. According to his attorney, Smith had spent his final months researching dietary and other theories he believed would benefit mankind. He was pronounced dead at 9:12 p.m. at the Greensville Correctional Center. Joseph Roger Odell III, July 23, 1997, lethal injection. He was executed for a 1985 essay and murder. His case attracted widespread international attention, with appeals for clemency from Pope John Paul II, Mother Teresa, and the Italian government due to doubts about his guilt. Odell was sentenced to death for the brutal killing of Helen Shartner, 31, a secretary in Virginia Beach. In February 1985, Shartner was last seen leaving a nightclub where Odell was also present. Her body was found the next day in a muddy field across from the club. She had been beaten with a handgun barrel, strangled with such force that her neck bones were broken, and she was also essayed. Tire tracks near the body matched Odell's car, and bloodstains on his clothing were initially found to be consistent with Shartner's blood type. Odell had a long history of violent crime, including a 1965 conviction for murdering a fellow inmate and a 114-year sentence in Florida for kidnapping and assaulting a store clerk. According to prison records, he declined a special final meal. He spent his final day in a highly unusual manner. He married his longtime advocate, Lori Earse, in a prison ceremony just hours before his execution. Earse married him partly to gain legal standing to continue fighting for DNA testing of the evidence after his death. Odell maintained his innocence until the very end, claiming that another executed inmate, David Mark Pruitt, was the real killer. In his final statements, he said that that day was the happiest day of his life because of their marriage and pledged to love her throughout eternity. Addressing the victim's son, who was believed to be witnessing, he said, "Eddie, I did not kill your mother." He told the governor, "You get to go home to your wife and little girl tonight," while maintaining he was being killed by the state of Virginia for a crime he did not commit. His spiritual advisor, Sister Helen Prejean, was present at his execution and stated that he met his death with dignity and pride. Carlton Jerome Pope, August 19, 1997, lethal injection. Pope was convicted for a violent crime spree that occurred only 3 months after he had been paroled for a prior felonious assault. On the night of January 12, 1986, Pope met Cynthia Lee Gray, 24, and her sister, Marcy Ann Kersheimer, outside the Portsmouth pool hall. He asked for a ride home, which they granted. Upon arriving at his destination, Pope produced a pistol and demanded their money. When they did not respond quickly enough, he shot Gray in the face, killing her. After shooting Gray, Pope struggled with Kersheimer and shot her in the neck and in the back of the head. Despite her life-threatening wound, she managed to drive her sister's car to a hospital and survived to positively identify Pope as the killer. Pope stole Gray's purse during the attack, which served as the underlying felony to elevate the murder to a capital offense. There are no records of his last meal. On the day of his execution, he was visited by his mother and met with his spiritual advisor. As he lay on the execution gurney at the Greensville Correctional Center, Pope spoke a final statement of religious peace and love. "I thank God for giving me peace. I love my mother. I thank God that Jesus Christ died for my sins." His execution took place after Governor George Allen denied clemency, noting that if Pope had not been paroled early for his previous 10-year sentence, Gray would likely still be alive. Mario Benjamin Murphy, September 17, 1997, lethal injection. He was a 25-year-old Mexican citizen and the only person among 6 co-defendants to receive the death penalty for a 1991 murder-for-hire plot. Murphy was convicted for his role in the contract killing of James Radcliffe, a Navy petty officer and cook from Virginia Beach. The murder was masterminded by the victim's wife, Robin Radcliffe, and her lover, Gary Hinojosa. They recruited Murphy and several teenagers to kill James so they could collect $100,000 in life insurance money. The murder took place on July 20, 1991. While James Radcliffe slept, Murphy and an accomplice, Aaron Turner, entered his bedroom. Murphy used a steel pipe to beat Radcliffe, and Turner stabbed him to death. Murphy was reportedly promised $5,000 for the hit. While Murphy was sentenced to death, the other 5 conspirators, including the masterminds, received life sentences through plea deals that were not offered to Murphy. Murphy's case drew international protests from the Mexican government and Amnesty International. As a Mexican national, Murphy was entitled under the Vienna Convention to be informed of his right to contact the Mexican consulate upon his arrest. Virginia authorities failed to do this, a violation the U.S. State Department later issued a profound apology for after the execution. There are no records of his last meal. He spent his final hours visiting with his mother and grandmother, appearing calm and worn out by the emotional process. As the lethal injection began, Murphy reportedly laughed and spoke with a sense of humor noted by his friends. His final words were, "Today is a good day to die. I forgive all of you. I hope God does too." Daoud Majid Mumin, November 13, 1997, lethal injection. Daoud Majid Mumin, born David Michael Allen, was executed by lethal injection after being on death row for a murder committed while he was already serving a 48-year sentence for a previous killing. He was responsible for the deaths of two people in separate incidents. Charles Shoup in 1973. In Grayson County, Virginia, a 19-year-old Mumin shot and killed Shoup, a 43-year-old taxi driver, during a robbery. He was convicted of first-degree murder and grand larceny. Several years later, Gladys Nopwaski, in 1988, was a victim of his. While serving his sentence for the 1973 murder, Mumin was assigned to a prison work detail with the Virginia Department of Transportation. On September 22, 1988, he escaped over a fence during a lunch break and walked to a nearby flooring store in Dale City. There, he essayed and murdered the proprietor, 42-year-old Gladys Nopwaski, stabbing her 16 times in the neck and chest with a screwdriver. He robbed her of only $4 and a Susan B. Anthony coin before returning to his work detail. His case, Mumin versus Virginia, reached the U.S. Supreme Court. The court ruled that judges are not constitutionally required to ask prospective jurors about the specific content of pretrial publicity they may have encountered, only whether they can remain impartial despite it. Mumin declined the special final meal and he offered no final statement in the death chamber. Before his death, one of his attorneys noted that he appeared to have made peace and accepted his fate. His execution prompted the Virginia Department of Corrections to end the use of violent offenders on unsupervised work details outside prison fences. Michael Charles Satcher, December 9, 1997, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for the 1990 essay and murder of a woman on a bike path in Arlington. Satcher's convictions stemmed from two separate attacks that occurred within minutes of each other on the night of March 31, 1990. Satcher accosted Anne Elizabeth Borghesani, 23, a paralegal, as she walked along the Martha Custis bike trail in Roslyn on her way to her 23rd birthday party. He essayed her and stabbed her 21 times before leaving her body in an office building stairwell. Approximately 20 minutes before the attack on Borghesani, Satcher attacked Deborah Abel on the same bike trail. He attempted to essay her and robbed her, but she managed to escape and later provided an identification that helped him link to the crimes. There are no records of his last meal. He spent his final hours visiting with his mother and sister. Satcher maintained his innocence until his death, claiming he was not the bike path killer. He did not speak in the death chamber, but he left a written statement released by his attorney. To my family, I want to say thanks for being the best family a person could ever have. I love you all. To my friends on death row, I would like to say see all of you on the other side. His execution was notable for a last-minute battle over DNA evidence. His lawyers argued that 1995 independent tests showed a 3 percentage point difference from his profile, outside the acceptable margin of error, but prosecutors called the difference scientifically meaningless, and the execution proceeded after the U.S. Supreme Court denied a stay. Thomas Howard Beavers Jr., December 11, 1997, lethal injection. He was executed for the 1990 essay and murder of a retired neighbor in Hampton. Beavers was convicted of capital murder, essay, grand larceny, and arson. His victim was Marguerite Lowery, 61, a retired school cafeteria manager who lived alone in Beavers' neighborhood. The murder took place on May 1, 1990. While Lowery was asleep, an 18-year-old Beavers broke into her home. When she woke up and went to investigate the noise, Beavers grabbed her, forced her back into her bedroom, essayed her, and suffocated her with a pillow. He stole jewelry from her dresser, vandalized the house, and stole the car, which he later set on fire. The murder went unsolved for a year until Beavers was arrested for the essay of another neighbor. Police found Lowery's jewelry in his bedroom during the investigation. Upon his arrest, he told authorities he would probably essay again if released. According to reports from the daily press, Beavers declined the special last meal. He spent his final hours with his legal team and spiritual advisors after his clemency request was denied by Governor George Allen. As the execution began at the Greensville Correctional Center, Beavers looked through the witness window, began to cry, and spoke the following: God bless them. I'm sorry for what I did. God bless them all. He also specifically asked for forgiveness from the victim's family and told his own friends and family that he loved them. His legal defense often highlighted a deeply troubled life. His mother suffered from schizophrenia and reportedly tried to kill him as a baby. He also faced significant physical abuse throughout his upbringing. He began sniffing gasoline at age 5 and later abused drugs and alcohol. He had two documented suicide attempts before the murder. He repeated grades twice in elementary school due to learning disabilities and eventually dropped out in the ninth grade. Tony Albert McCall, February 10, 1998, lethal injection. He was on death row for a capital murder and robbery committed during the 1986 holiday season. McCall was convicted of a violent crime spree in Prince William County on December 9, 1986. Mary Elizabeth Dan was 31 years old and a cashier at a Shell gas station in Woodbridge. While her husband was on a ladder hanging Christmas lights outside and her two young daughters, aged 5 and 6, were nearby, McCall entered the booth, demanded money, and shot her in the head. He robbed the station of $515. The woman died the following day without regaining consciousness. Shortly after the murder, McCall drove to a nearby townhouse and shot Michael Keating twice in the head while attempting to steal his car. Keating miraculously survived and testified against McCall, recounting that McCall fired the second shot specifically because he realized Keating was still alive. McCall's defense argued he suffered from severe head trauma during a troubled childhood and had a low IQ, estimated at 64, which they claimed made him ineligible for the death penalty. His trial was notable for the testimony of April Dan, the victim's daughter, who was only 5 years old when she witnessed her mother's murder. Official records do not detail a specific special menu request for Tony Albert McCall. He spent his final hours with his legal team and was visited by spiritual advisors before his 9 p.m. execution. As the lethal chemicals began to flow, McCall addressed the family of Mary Dan, specifically her daughters, who were present to witness the execution. I know it is a hard thing to wind up without a mother, and I ask you to forgive me. I'm sorry for what I have caused. He was pronounced dead at 9:10 p.m. Douglas MacArthur Buchanan Jr., March 18, 1998, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for a quadruple homicide that took place in Naola, Virginia in 1987. On September 15, 1987, Buchanan murdered four members of his own family. The motive was described as a combination of a domestic dispute and long-standing pent-up rage. Buchanan claimed he had felt ostracized and mistreated as an outsider ever since his father remarried shortly after his mother's death from cancer years earlier. The killings began after an argument with his father over a remark made about Buchanan's deceased mother. After the murders, he fled with his wife, Christiane, but they were captured in New Mexico 17 days later. The four victims were killed using a rifle, a pistol, and a knife. Douglas Buchanan Sr., 43, was Buchanan's father. He was shot in the back of the head and then again between the eyes while on the floor. Donald Buchanan was 13 years old and was Buchanan's half-brother. He was shot in the back of the head and face when he arrived home from school. Joel Jerry Buchanan was 10 years old and was also Buchanan's half-brother. He was shot while trying to run away. When he still showed signs of life, Buchanan stabbed him 5 times with one wound severing his carotid artery. Geraldine Patterson Buchanan, 31, was Buchanan's stepmother. He waited for her to return home, shot her, and then slashed her throat so severely that the cut reached her spine. According to prison records, Buchanan's final meal consisted of fried chicken, sliced bread, chocolate cake, and a beverage. As he lay on the execution gurney, Buchanan reportedly smiled at the witnesses in the adjacent booth and spoke his final words. Basically, get the ride started. I'm ready to go. His case, Buchanan versus Angelone, eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, where it was determined that capital sentencing juries do not need to be specifically instructed on the concept of mitigating evidence. Ronald Watkins, March 25, 1998, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for the May 26, 1988 robbery and murder of his former employer in Danville, Virginia. William Bill McCauley, 52, was the owner of Allied Services. Watkins, who had previously worked for McCauley, entered the business to rob it. Watkins confessed to stabbing McCauley 7 times in the back and slashing his throat. He stole approximately $1,000 during the attack. Watkins called the police days later, admitting to the crime and stating that a female acquaintance he had been with at the time knew nothing about the killing. While on death row, Watkins underwent a significant religious conversion and became a born-again Christian. This conversion led to a high-profile clemency campaign. The former First Lady Rosalind Carter wrote a letter to Governor Jim Gilmore pleading for mercy, stating that Watkins was a different man than the one who committed the murder. Amnesty International also advocated for his life to be spared, focusing on his rehabilitation. There are no records of his last meal. In his final hours, he reportedly met with his spiritual advisor and supporters. Watkins offered a final statement expressing deep remorse and taking full responsibility for his actions. He directed his last words to the family of his victim. "I am very sorry for the pain I have caused the McCauley family. I ask for your forgiveness." Governor Gilmore denied clemency, noting that religious conversion after a crime does not absolve a person of the requirement to pay the penalty for that crime. Angel Francisco Briard, April 14, 1998, lethal injection. This case gained international prominence due to violations of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, leading to interventions by the International Court of Justice and the U.S. State Department. Briard was a Paraguayan national who was convicted of a brutal execution-style slaying in Arlington, Virginia. Ruth Dickey, 39, was a neighbor of Briard. On February 17, 1992, Briard accosted her in her apartment. He attempted to essay Dickey and then stabbed her 5 times in the neck. DNA testing definitively matched genetic material found on the victim's body to Briard's profile. During his trial, against his attorney's advice, Briard took the stand and confessed to the murder. He claimed he had committed the act because he was under the influence of a satanic curse placed on him by his ex-wife's father. The central issue in his appeals was that Virginia authorities failed to inform him of his right as a foreign national to contact the Paraguayan consulate. Briard had rejected the plea deal for a life sentence, choosing instead to plead for mercy from the jury. His lawyers argued that if he had consulted with consular officials, they might have persuaded him to accept the plea. The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately ruled that Briard had procedurally defaulted on his treaty claim because he did not raise it during his initial state court appeals. There are no records of his last meal. He spent his final hours meeting with his legal team and was visited by his spiritual advisor. As he lay on the execution gurney, Briard appeared dazed and fearful. His final recorded words were, "May glory be to God." He was pronounced dead at 10:39 p.m. Dennis Wayne Eaton, June 18, 1998, lethal injection. He was executed for a violent 1989 rampage that claimed 4 lives. He committed 4 murders across 2 Virginia counties within an 8-hour span. Walter Custer Jr., 26. He was Ethan's roommate. Ethan shot him in their mobile home, reportedly out of jealousy over Custer's relationship with Ethan's girlfriend. Ripley Marston Sr., 68. He was a former neighbor. After killing Custer, Ethan broke into Marston's home, shot him in the head, and stole $15 and his car for a getaway. Jerry Hines, 48. He was a Virginia state trooper. While fleeing south with his girlfriend, Ethan was pulled over by Trooper Hines on I-81 near Lexington. Hines was shot twice and left to die. This specific murder resulted in Ethan's death sentence. Judy Ann McDonald, 24, Ethan's girlfriend. Following a high-speed chase that ended when Ethan crashed into a telephone pole in Salem, he shot McDonald in the head as police closed in. Ethan then turned the gun on himself, surviving a self-inflicted head wound that required the removal of his right eye. Ethan requested a final special meal but asked that its contents not be described to the public. In his final statement, he expressed remorse and thanked his church community. "I would like to say that I am sorry. Thank you to all my brothers and sisters at Faith Church for being there for me. I love you all so much. Mom, I love you." Ethan received 3 life terms for the murders of Custer, Marston, and McDonald, to which he pleaded guilty. He pleaded innocent only to the murder of Trooper Hines, claiming his girlfriend was the shooter. His case was notable for the clemency plea from Maria Hines, the sister of the slain trooper and a former nun. After meeting Eaton on death row, she stated she forgave him and urged Governor Jim Gilmore to spare his life. However, clemency was denied. Danny Lee King, July 23, 1998, lethal injection. He was executed for the 1990 robbery and murder of a real estate agent. He was the 50th person executed in the state since capital punishment was reinstated. King was convicted of capital murder, robbery, and forgery. Carolyn Horton Rogers, 55, was a well-regarded real estate agent in Roanoke County. The murder took place on October 11, 1990. King and his wife, Becky Hodges King, lured Rogers to a vacant home in the Kings Chase residential area by posing as Danny and Becky Keaton, a couple interested in buying a house. Once inside, King lured Rogers to the basement where he beat, choked, and stomped on her before stabbing her in the chest. After the killing, they stole her jewelry, including her wedding ring and her car, and forged several checks from her purse. They were captured 4 days later in Ohio in a stolen van. The case was notable for the conflicting stories told by King and his wife. Under Virginia's triggerman rule, only the actual killer can receive the death penalty. King initially confessed to being the killer in statements to Becky's attorneys to protect her. However, at his own trial, he changed his story, claiming Becky was the one who stabbed Rogers. Until his death, King maintained his innocence, famously stating just a week before his execution, "They're going to be executing someone who is innocent, and what's going to be buried with me is the truth." Danny Lee King refused the final meal. He spent his final hours with his wife, Karen King, whom he had married while incarcerated in 1996. King offered no final words in the death chamber. When asked by the warden if he wished to make a statement, he simply shook his head. He was pronounced dead at 9:11 p.m. Lance Antonio Chandler Jr., August 20, 1998, lethal injection. He was executed for the 1993 robbery and murder of a convenience store clerk. Chandler was convicted of capital murder, robbery, and conspiracy for a crime committed in Halifax County. William Billy Dix was 33 years old and a clerk at Mother Hubbard's convenience store near South Boston, Virginia. The murder took place on February 7, 1993. Chandler and 3 accomplices targeted the store because Chandler believed Dix was a little slow and would not resist. When Dix did not immediately respond to a demand for money, Chandler pointed a revolver at him, closed his eyes, and said "boom" while pulling the trigger. The gun did not fire on the first pull. Chandler pulled the trigger a second time, shooting Dix in the face. Dix was paralyzed and died shortly after. The group fled with only a case of beer. Accomplices testified that Chandler had expressed a desire to know what it was like to kill a man and planned to wear the used shell casing around his neck as a souvenir. Official records indicate that Lance Chandler declined a special last meal. He was served the standard prison fare before his execution. When the warden asked if he had a final statement, Chandler looked up, shook his head, and simply said, "No, sir." At the time of the murder, Chandler was 19 years old and had a lengthy criminal record starting from age 14. During his trial, he claimed he was under the influence of alcohol and cocaine and believed the gun contained empty shells, thinking he would have to pull the trigger multiple times before a live round fired. His appeals, which focused on the lack of mitigating evidence presented during his sentencing phase, were rejected 7-2 by the U.S. Supreme Court. John L. Dubois, August 31, 1998, electrocution. He was executed when he was 31 years old. His case was legally significant because he was sentenced to death despite a plea agreement in which prosecutors promised not to seek the maximum penalty. Dubois was convicted of capital murder for a robbery committed on November 20, 1991, in Portsmouth, Virginia. Philip Council, 39, was a convenience store clerk who suffered from mental and neurological disabilities due to a previous car accident. Dubois and 3 teenage accomplices entered the In a Hurry store to rob it. When Council struggled to open a jammed cash register quickly enough, the unarmed accomplices beat him. Dubois, the only one armed, then shot Council in the chest. The group stole approximately $400 before fleeing. At the time of the crime, Dubois was 25 years old and on parole with a history of larceny, assault, and firearm possession. In exchange for a guilty plea and cooperation against his accomplices, the Commonwealth's attorney agreed not to seek the death penalty. Portsmouth Circuit Judge Johnny Morrison rejected the recommendation, ruling that Dubois' lifestyle as a drug dealer, reportedly earning $2,500 a month while fathering 9 children he did not support, posed a continuing threat to society. Dubois requested a special final meal but asked that the menu not be released to the public. He spent his final hours meeting with spiritual advisors, but he was not visited by family. As he lay on the execution gurney, Dubois addressed his final statement to those he left behind. "I send love to my family and friends and everyone who knows me. That's it." 11 members of the victim's family witnessed the execution. Kenneth Manuel Stewart Jr., September 23, 1998, electrocution. He was the first state prisoner to die in the electric chair since Virginia began giving inmates a choice between electrocution and lethal injection back in 1995. Stewart was sentenced to death for the May 19, 1991 murders of his estranged family at their Bedford County farmhouse. Cynthia Stewart was 34 years old and his wife. Stewart went to her home to discuss reconciliation. When she refused, he shot her twice in the head at point-blank range. Jonathan Stewart was 5 months old. He was his infant son. After killing Cynthia, Stewart went downstairs and shot Jonathan twice in the side of the head. Stewart arranged the bodies in bed so the infant was cradled in his mother's arms before locking the house and fleeing to Ohio. He claimed the act was driven by a mixture of rage, jealousy, and alcohol. There are no records of his last meal. In the weeks leading up to his execution, he had been struggling with the decision to die and spent his final days meeting his legal and spiritual advisors. Stewart famously chose the electric chair over lethal injection for a unique personal reason. He told reporters, "They can shoot me, they can hang me, or do what they want, but I won't die with my arms outstretched, like the Son of God." When given the opportunity to speak in the death chamber, Stewart made no formal final statement. At the time of his trial, the prosecution argued his lengthy criminal history, including assaulting a police officer and multiple DUIs, which demonstrated his future dangerousness, a key predicate for the death penalty. Dwayne Allen Wright, October 14, 1998, lethal injection. His case was a subject of international controversy as he was only 17 years old at the time of his crimes, making him the first juvenile offender executed in Virginia since 1924. Wright's death sentence stemmed from a 5-day violent shooting spree in October 1989 across Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Saba Tekle, 34, was an Ethiopian immigrant and mother of 3. On October 13, 1989, Wright confronted her outside her apartment in Virginia. He forced her to partially undress at gunpoint, and when she attempted to flee screaming, he shot her in the back with a .38 caliber pistol. She collapsed and died in the doorway of her apartment. Reginald Thurman, 24. He was murdered by Wright on October 12, 1989, in Clinton, Maryland, during an armed robbery. Wright received 2 life sentences in Maryland for this crime. Odell Thomas, 31. He was murdered by Wright on October 9, 1989, in Washington, D.C. Wright's execution was heavily protested by organizations like Amnesty International and the Children's Defense Fund due to his age and mental health. He was 17 at the time of the murders, a factor that opponents argued should have barred the death penalty under international human rights standards. Attorneys presented evidence that Wright suffered from brain damage at birth and potential mental illness. His IQ was reportedly 75, evaluated as borderline retarded. Years later, a juror stated that had she been informed of Wright's childhood trauma and mental history, she would not have voted for the death sentence. There are no records of his last meal. While strapped to the gurney, Wright chose to make no formal final statement to the witnesses or the public. Ronald Lee Fitzgerald, October 21, 1998, lethal injection. He was executed for a violent 7-hour crime spree that took place on January 29, 1993. Fitzgerald's one-day reign of terror in Southside Virginia involved 2 murders and 2 essays. Coy White, 39. He was the uncle of Fitzgerald's girlfriend. Fitzgerald broke into White's home in Chatham, shot him in the neck, and robbed him. Claudia White, 13, a relative of his girlfriend. After killing Coy White, Fitzgerald abducted her, forced her to retrieve White's wallet, drove her to a remote barn, and essayed her. Hugh Morrison, 72. He was a taxi driver who had previously driven Fitzgerald's girlfriend to a clinic. Fitzgerald flagged down Morrison's cab, shot him 3 times, and dumped his body in a creek. Tiffany Lovelace, 18. After killing the taxi driver, Fitzgerald drove the stolen cab to a motel in Alta Vista, where he abducted and essayed Lovelace in a bathroom while her children watched television. The defense claimed Fitzgerald was spurred by a jealous rage after learning another man claimed to be the father of his girlfriend's child. According to official records, he declined a special last meal. He spent his final hours with his attorney and was reportedly resigned to his fate, even refusing to seek clemency from Governor Jim Gilmore because he felt the killings were wrong. Speaking softly on the execution gurney, Fitzgerald gave a lengthy final statement, apologizing for the pain he caused. I hope that by my dying tonight, this will ease their pain. I love you all. He asked for forgiveness from the victims' families and told his own family he loved them. Following his crime spree, Fitzgerald hitched a ride to the Pennsylvania County Courthouse to turn himself in. Upon arrival, he put a gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, but the gun jammed, leading to his immediate arrest. He later claimed to have tattoos on his chest reading lethal injection and die with a drawing of a syringe. Kenneth Wilson, November 17, 1998, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for the brutal 1993 essay and murder of his neighbor in Newport News, Virginia. He was convicted of capital murder, attempted essay, grand larceny, and multiple counts of abduction and malicious wounding. Jacqueline Stevens was 31 years old and a nurse's aide and neighbor of Wilson. On March 27, 1993, Wilson entered her home at approximately 3 a.m. At knife point, Wilson forced Stevens, her 12-year-old daughter Altomika, and a 14-year-old friend Takesha Banks upstairs. While Stevens was in the shower, Wilson tied and blindfolded the two girls. When Stevens emerged from the shower to confront him, a struggle ensued. Wilson tied Stevens' spread eagle to her bedpost and stabbed her more than 10 times, eventually slashing her throat. During the ordeal, Wilson also stabbed both young girls in the neck. Altomika's vocal cord nerve was severed during the attack. Wilson fled in Stevens' car but was found a few hours later hiding in a nearby trash dumpster. He did not request a special final meal. He reportedly ate the standard prison fare before his execution. He also did not offer a final statement in the death chamber. When the warden asked if he had anything to say, Wilson remained silent and did not respond. He was pronounced dead at 9:09 p.m. Wilson's defense focused on claims of temporary insanity caused by voluntary intoxication from cocaine and opiates, which were found in his system after the crime. However, the court found his actions, such as separating the victims and demanding car keys, demonstrated a mind capable of premeditation. Governor Jim Gilmore denied a last-minute clemency plea that had requested commutation for the sake of Wilson's two young sons. Kevin Wayne Cardwell, December 3, 1998, lethal injection. He was 29 years old at the time of his death. Cardwell was convicted of the 1991 abduction, robbery, and capital murder of Anthony Tony Brown, a 15-year-old from Hempstead, New York. Cardwell and several associates targeted Brown, a drug courier, upon his arrival at a Richmond bus station. After initially finding no drugs in his luggage, they lured the teenager to Cardwell's apartment, where they discovered cocaine taped to his leg. Cardwell forced the boy into a secluded wooded area in Henrico County. Despite the teenager reportedly begging for his life, Cardwell slashed his throat and shot him twice in the back of the head. The jury recommended the death penalty based on the vileness of the crime. He requested that the details of his final meal not be released to the public. Cardwell used his final statement to criticize the witnesses attending the execution. While strapped to the gurney, he reportedly said, "Personally, yeah, why was all them sick people looking at me through that glass?" He spent his final day meeting with his grandmother, his attorney, and prison clergy. His appeals, which argued his trial lawyers failed to present evidence of his troubled mental health, were rejected 7-2 by the U.S. Supreme Court just hours before the execution. Mark Arlo Shepard, January 20, 1999, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for a double murder committed during a robbery in late 1993. Shepard was a crack cocaine dealer who, along with accomplice Andre Graham, murdered a married couple they were supplying with drugs. Richard Rosenblatt was 40 years old and he was shot twice in the head at close range. Rebecca Rosenblatt was 35 and she was shot 4 times in the head and neck. Prosecutors stated the pair killed the couple on November 28, 1993, when the Rosenblatt's finances began to dwindle and they were unable to pay for their cocaine. They also robbed the couple of their jewelry and car. Shepard requested the vegetarian meal set from the prison standard menu: boiled potatoes, fried cabbage, bean entree, bread pudding, sliced bread, fruit punch, and milk. When he was asked to make a final statement, Shepard mumbled 4 specific dates, believed by his attorney to be the birthdays of family members or close friends. After reciting each date, he said, "I love you." His accomplice, Andre Graham, received a life sentence for the Rosenblatt murders, but he was eventually executed in December 1999 for the separate 1993 murder of Cheryl Stack. Tony Leslie Fry, February 4, 1999, lethal injection. Fry was convicted of capital murder and robbery for the slaying of Leland Jacobs, 42, a salesman at a Richmond area Ford dealership. On February 21, 1994, Fry and the 17-year-old accomplice, Bradford Henson, lured Jacobs from the dealership under the ruse of a test drive for a Ford Explorer. After driving to a remote dirt road, Fry shot Jacobs 11 times with a .22 caliber handgun. While Jacobs was still alive and begging for his life, Fry and his accomplice tied Jacobs's necktie to the rear bumper of the vehicle and dragged him more than 700 feet into the woods. A medical examiner testified that Jacobs likely remained conscious during part of the dragging. During his trial, testimony revealed Fry had also confessed to robbing 3 churches and a grave, as well as arson. There are no records of his last meal. He was reported to have visited with his grandmother and aunts in his final hours. As he was prepared for the execution, Fry offered a brief statement of remorse. "I am sorry for what I've done, and I have made peace with myself." A judge imposed the death penalty after finding the crime outrageously and wantonly vile due to the aggravated battery. His accomplice, Bradford Henson, was convicted of first-degree murder and received an 88-year prison sentence. Fry refused to ask Governor Jim Gilmore for clemency, stating he had no illusions that the petition would be granted. George Adrian Quesenberry Jr., March 9, 1999, lethal injection. Quesenberry and Eric Henkel broke into Tri-City Electrical Supply in Chesterfield County at 6 a.m. on September 25, 1989. When the owner, 63-year-old Thomas Haynes, arrived, Quesenberry chased and shot him with a .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun. Haynes was shot in the back, and when he attempted to get up, Quesenberry hit him in the head with the gun, causing a skull fracture. The perpetrator stole $200 in coins. Thomas Haynes was known in the community for helping those in need. Quesenberry's defense argued for clemency due to a history of severe abuse. At age 2, he witnessed his mother's suicide, and before age 4, he was reportedly essayed by his grandfather. He was also frequently beaten and had 2 previous head injuries. There are no records of his last meal. He was baptized on the day of his execution and spent his last hours with his family. His final words expressed love for his family and remorse for his actions. "I just want my family to know I love them, and to the victim's family, I am sorry for what I've done." Governor Gilmore denied clemency, citing Quesenberry's admission of guilt. David Lee Fisher, March 25, 1999, lethal injection. He was executed for a 1983 murder-for-hire plot. His case was historically significant as he was the first person ever convicted of capital murder by a Bedford County jury. Fisher was sentenced to death for the murder of David William Wilkie, an 18-year-old from Charlotte, North Carolina. The murder took place on November 21, 1983. Fisher arranged for his associate, Bobby Bryce Mulligan, to shoot Wilkie during a staged hunting trip in Bedford County. Mulligan shot Wilkie in the back with a 12-gauge shotgun. Fisher had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on Wilkie just a month before the killing. After the insurer questioned the claim, Fisher only collected a $25,000 settlement. According to Mulligan's confession, after Wilkie was shot, Fisher reached into the wound and attempted to stop the 18-year-old's heart. Fisher was a former con man and a mob snitch who had entered the federal witness protection program in the 1970s under the name Lehman Curtis Fortner. There are no records of his last meal. He was reported to have spent his final hours with his family and legal counsel. Fisher maintained his innocence until the very end, using his final statement to lash out at his co-conspirator and the governor. Tonight, I hope you sleep well, because you know you lied on me to give me this death sentence. And to you, Governor Gilmore, you know I am an innocent man. The scheme unraveled in 1985 when a third man, Gerald Stedham, went to the FBI after Fisher allegedly offered him money to kill Mulligan to keep him quiet. Mulligan eventually confessed and received a life sentence in exchange for his testimony against Fisher. Carl Hamilton Chichester, April 13, 1999. He was convicted of capital murder, armed robbery, and firearms violations. Timothy Rigney, 30 years old, was the manager of a Little Caesars pizza shop in Manassas, Virginia. The murder took place on August 16, 1991. Chichester and an accomplice, Sheldon Maurice McDowell, entered the store wearing masks just before closing time. When Rigney failed to promptly open a second cash register, Chichester shot him once in the chest at close range with a semi-automatic handgun. The pair fled with approximately $100 in cash. Chichester was identified months later while staying at a local hotel. He did request a final special last meal, but specifically asked the prison officials not to make the menu public. He spent his final day visiting with his wife and other family members. He was reported to be muttering four-letter words as he was led into the execution chamber. However, his formal final statement while strapped to the gurney focused on his family. I love my wife and my children. Notably, after the needles were inserted into his arms, he thanked the execution team for their professionalism. Until his death, he maintained his innocence, claiming his accomplice was the actual triggerman. His defense team presented affidavits from two original jurors who stated they would have favored a life sentence had they known of conflicting witness statements regarding who fired the shots. Arthur Ray Jenkins III, April 20, 1999, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for a particularly brutal double homicide and robbery committed in 1990. The murders took place on October 12, 1990, in Warren County, Virginia. Floyd Jenkins was 72 years old and Arthur's own uncle, with whom he had been living following a previous release from prison. Lee Hopewell Brinklow was 70 years old and a close friend of Floyd Jenkins, who shared a residence. After a day of drinking and an argument, Jenkins used a .22 caliber rifle to shoot both men in the head. While Brinklow pleaded for mercy, Jenkins shot him again. Finding his uncle still gagging and alive on the floor, Jenkins used a butcher knife to stab him 7 times in the abdomen so severely that his internal organs were exposed. Following the killings, Jenkins robbed both victims of their wallets and cash, stole valuables from his aunt's bedroom, and attempted to hide the bodies in the back of a truck. Jenkins' final meal consisted of pepper steak, macaroni and cheese, apple pie, and tea. As he was being prepared for the lethal injection, he cried out several times. His final statement was a brief plea for spiritual mercy. Forgive me for my sins. Jenkins had a documented history of mental illness with an IQ of approximately 65. His defense argued that his mental state and history of abuse while previously incarcerated in a county jail contributed to his violent behavior. Despite these appeals and his mental health status, Governor Gilmore denied clemency, noting the overwhelming evidence of guilt and the grisly nature of the crimes. Eric Christopher Payne, April 28, 1999, lethal injection. Payne committed a series of brutal hammer attacks in the Richmond area in June 1997, just months after being released from a 6-year prison sentence for LSD possession. Ruth Parham was 61 years old. On June 5, 1997, Payne bludgeoned and attempted to assay Parham, a cleaning woman in Hanover County. She suffered 4 depressed skull fractures from hammer blows. Sally Marie Fazio was 57 years old. On June 11, 1997, just 6 days later, Payne essayed, robbed, and beat Fazio to death in her Richmond home. Ridley and Dean Fleck. On the same day as the Fazio murder, Payne attacked Ridley Fleck and her 8-year-old son Dean as they left a movie theater. Both suffered extensive head wounds from a hammer, but survived. Payne's defense highlighted a life of extreme institutionalization and trauma. When Payne was 4 months old, his father shot his mother to death and then hanged himself in a jail cell. After his aunt surrendered custody of him at age 6, Payne was raised in a long succession of foster homes and juvenile institutions. His lawyers argued he never received the counseling he required while in jail and was under extreme stress upon his final release. Official records do not specify a unique special final meal request for Payne. Just before the lethal chemicals were administered, Payne addressed his wife, Margie, who was present to witness the execution. I love you, Margie. We will be together again. He was pronounced dead at 9:04 p.m. Payne notably refused to file appeals or seek clemency to delay his sentence. Ronald Dale Yeats, April 29, 1999, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for a 1989 robbery and murder. He was convicted for the capital murder and robbery of Ruby Meeks Dodson, 70. The murder took place on September 23, 1989. After consuming alcohol, Mary Jane, and crack cocaine, Yates and an accomplice, Charles Michael Vernon, went to Dodson's home. They gained entry by falsely claiming their car had broken down. While Vernon searched the house for money, Yates attacked Dodson in her kitchen. He stabbed her at least 12 times in the face, neck, and chest and slashed her throat with a pocket knife. The pair stole Dodson's pocketbook, which contained approximately $700. Yates was linked to the scene by bloody tennis shoe prints and his girlfriend's sunglasses, which were found near the victim's body. He also confessed to his sister-in-law and to the police. Official records do not detail a specific last meal for him. He was served the standard prison meal provided to all inmates on the evening of his execution. He offered no final statement in the death chamber. He remained silent as the lethal chemicals were administered and was pronounced dead at 9:03 p.m. His execution took place just hours after Governor Gilmore denied the clemency petition. Tommy David Strickler, July 21, 1999, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for the 1990 kidnapping, robbery, and capital murder of a university student, Leanne Marion Whitlock, who was 19 years old. She was a sophomore at James Madison University. The murder took place on January 5, 1990. Strickler and an accomplice, Ronald Lee Henderson, abducted Whitlock from a shopping mall parking lot in Harrisonburg, Virginia, while she was returning her boyfriend's car. They drove her to a secluded field in Augusta County, where she was stripped and beaten. Strickler was identified as the ringleader who killed Whitlock by dropping a 69-pound rock on her head multiple times, crushing her skull. Her body was found 8 days later. About an hour after the murder, Strickler and Henderson went to a local nightclub to drink and dance. Strickler requested that information regarding his final meal not be released to the public. He maintained his innocence until his final moments. His last statement was, "I am innocent. I did not do it. I hope everyone else will find the peace that I have found, and to all of my family, I love them dearly. I will always be with them." His case, Strickler versus Green, reached the U.S. Supreme Court. The court ruled that although prosecutors had withheld exculpatory evidence, notes casting doubt on a key eyewitness's memory, the suppressed material was not enough to change the jury's verdict, and his death sentence was upheld. Marlon Dwayne Williams, August 17, 1999, lethal injection. Williams was convicted for the premeditated murder for hire of Helen Bedsole. The victim's husband, Clark, hired Williams to kill his wife while the two were in the middle of a divorce. Williams, who had been selling cocaine with Clark Bedsole for several years, accepted $4,000 to perform the killing. The murder took place on November 9, 1993. Williams rode a bicycle to Helen Bedsole's home. He broke through a storm door, entered the kitchen, and shot her twice in the head at close range. At the time of his sentencing, it was also noted that Williams had been convicted of burglary and malicious wounding for cutting the throat of Virginia Parker, 71, the grandmother of his girlfriend, in 1994. Although he orchestrated the murder, Clark Bedsole was sentenced to life in prison rather than death. Williams pleaded guilty to capital murder in 1995. A judge sentenced him to death based on a finding of future dangerousness, describing him as a manipulative, aggressive, and violent person who killed for nothing but money. Like many others before him, he did request a special final meal, but specifically asked that the details not be disclosed to the public. He also did not make a final statement. Witnesses noted he was visibly shaking from the moment he entered the death chamber until the procedure began. His execution proceeded after the U.S. Supreme Court refused the final stay just hours before he was pronounced dead at 9:03 p.m. Everett Lee Mueller, September 16, 1999, lethal injection. Mueller was convicted for the October 1990 killing of 10-year-old Charity Amberly Powers, a fifth grader from Chesterfield County. On the night of October 5, 1990, Charity was dropped off at a skating rink. A family friend failed to pick her up as planned, and Charity walked to a nearby Hardee's restaurant to use a telephone. Mueller, a 30-year-old laborer with a history of offenses, approached her in his wood-sided station wagon and offered her a ride home. Instead, he took her to a wooded area near his home where he essayed and strangled or stabbed her to death. Charity's body was found 4 months later in a shallow grave, only 900 feet from Mueller's residence. Mueller later confessed on videotape, though he claimed during his clemency petition that he had only found the body and feared being blamed due to his prior record. There are no records of his last meal. When asked by the warden if he had a final statement in the death chamber, Mueller shook his head no and remained silent until he was pronounced dead at 9:04 p.m. Mueller's case reached the U.S. Supreme Court over a controversy regarding his interrogation. During 4 hours of questioning, Mueller asked, "Do you think I need an attorney here?" But the detective shrugged and continued the interview. The court allowed his confession to be used as evidence. Jason Matthew Joseph, October 19, 1999, lethal injection. He was executed for the 1992 robbery and murder of a fast food restaurant employee. Joseph's death sentence resulted from a violent crime spree in Portsmouth, Virginia. Jeffrey Anderson, 24, was a worker at a Subway sandwich shop. On October 26, 1992, Joseph and an accomplice, Melvin Powell, entered the store to rob it for drug money. After Anderson complied with demands and lay down behind the counter, Joseph leaned over and shot him once in the back. The killing was captured on the store's video surveillance system. At the time of his sentencing, Joseph was also convicted of a separate spree that included the armed robbery and abduction of two convenience store clerks. Joseph was raised by a single mother after his father abandoned the family when Joseph was 3 years old. He was a high school dropout and was unemployed at the time of the murders. His defense argued that a lack of emotional nurturance and a brain injury left him prone to violent reactions under stress. He was heavily addicted to crack cocaine during his crime spree and reportedly participated in a substance abuse program while incarcerated. Official records do not specify a special final meal request for Jason Joseph. He chose not to make a final statement in the death chamber. Witnesses noted that he remained stoic and silent until he was pronounced dead at 9:10 p.m. at the Greensville Correctional Center. Joseph's case was notable for claims of juror misconduct. His lawyers argued that some jurors had been influenced by inflammatory newspaper reports that incorrectly claimed Joseph made a profane remark to the victim's family after the verdict. Governor Jim Gilmore denied his clemency petition, stating that Joseph's guilt was undeniable and his legal appeals had been thoroughly reviewed. Thomas Lee Royal Jr., November 9, 1999, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for the premeditated murder of a police officer, a crime committed as part of a targeted retaliatory plot against law enforcement. His victim was Hampton police officer Kenneth Earl Wallace, 29 years old. The murder was committed on February 21, 1994. While Officer Wallace sat in his patrol car in the Pocahontas Place section of YT, Royal approached and shot him twice in the head at close range with a .38 caliber handgun. Officer Wallace, a 7-year veteran and father, died 4 days later. Royal and his accomplices had planned to kill a different officer, Curtis Cooper, because Cooper had recently arrested Royal's brother for a major drug offense. Wallace was not the original target, but was killed because he was found in a cruiser similar to the one they were hunting. At the time of the shooting, Royal was on probation for a drug conviction and was later convicted of second-degree murder for his role in the 1991 drug-related slaying of James Smith Jr., for which he supplied the murder weapon. For his final meal, Royal requested chicken, French fries, pineapple upside down cake, and iced tea. Royal maintained a calm and resigned demeanor in his final moments. His last statement in the execution chamber was, I just want to say, how you gonna kill a man when a man is willing to die? Remember, Wallace wasn't ready to die. Let's roll. Royal spent his final hours with a large number of family members and was baptized by a volunteer prison chaplain that afternoon. He had previously offered a tearful apology to Officer Wallace's father during his sentencing hearing in 1994. Andre Lee Graham, December 9, 1999, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for a 1993 robbery and murder, and his execution followed that of his accomplice, Mark Arlo Shepard, by 11 months. Graham was a drug dealer and a hustler linked to a violent crime spree in late 1993. Cheryl Stack, 20 years old, was a waitress and university student. On October 8, 1993, Graham and Shepard robbed Stack and her boyfriend, Edward Martin, in a restaurant parking lot in Richmond. Despite their cooperation, Graham shot both victims execution style. Stack died 2 days later. Martin survived but suffered permanent brain damage and partial paralysis. Graham received a death sentence specifically for Stack's murder. Richard, 40, and Rebecca, 35, Rosenblatt. This was a married couple from Chesterfield County who had been buying cocaine from the pair. On November 28, 1993, Graham and Shepard went to their home to settle a drug debt and murdered them. Richard was shot twice in the head and Rebecca was shot 4 times. Graham received a life sentence plus 23 years for these murders. Graham and Shepard were suspected in at least 10 other murders in the Richmond area. According to official records, Graham chose to have the standard prison meal for his final meal rather than making a special request. He spent his final afternoon receiving visits from his family members. He maintained his innocence regarding the actual shooting of Cheryl Stack until the end, claiming Shepard was the true gunman. In an interview the day before his execution, he said, I'm not a punk, but sometimes I cry, not because I'm scared, but because I'm confused. In his final moments in the death chamber, he was described as being confused and reportedly cried before the lethal chemicals were administered. He was pronounced dead at 9:08 p.m. Douglas Christopher Thomas, January 10, 2000, lethal injection. Thomas was sentenced to death for the 1990 murders of his girlfriend's parents when he was just 17 years old. He was convicted of the capital murder of Kathy Wiseman and first-degree murder of James Baxter Wiseman. The Wisemans were attempting to end the relationship between Thomas and their 14-year-old daughter, Jessica Wiseman. The teenage couple plotted to get rid of her parents so they could be together. The murder happened on November 10, 1990. Jessica let Thomas into her home through an open window at night. Using a 12-gauge shotgun, Thomas shot J.B. Wiseman once in the chest while he slept, killing him instantly. Kathy Wiseman was shot in the face, walked down the hallway toward Jessica's room, and was then shot a second time, which was fatal. Jessica was convicted as a juvenile because she was only 14 at the time. She was released in 1997 upon turning 21, a disparity that Thomas criticized as a little extreme before his execution. Thomas was served a standard prison meal for his final supper. While many sources mention he was prepared to go, they do not highlight a specific special last meal. Douglas Christopher Thomas made no final statement in the death chamber. Although he remained silent on the gurney, he spoke extensively in interviews leading up to his death, expressing remorse and stating, Judge me for what I am now. I am now someone who is mature. He spent his final hours with his spiritual advisor and noted he was prepared to go if it was God's will. Thomas was one of the last juvenile offenders executed in the U.S. before the 2005 Supreme Court ruling, Roper v. Simmons, banned the practice. Steve Edward Roach, January 13, 2000, lethal injection. His case drew significant international protest because he was 17 years old at the time of the crime, making him one of the last juvenile offenders executed in the U.S. Roach was sentenced to death for the 1993 robbery and murder of his elderly neighbor. Mary Ann Hughes was a 70-year-old widow that Roach considered a friend. On December 3, 1993, Roach went to her home and, without provocation, shot her once in the chest with a 12-gauge shotgun when she opened the door. After the shooting, Roach stole her purse, which contained approximately $60, and her 1981 Buick Regal. He fled to North and South Carolina before surrendering to police in Virginia days later. He was convicted of capital murder, robbery, and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. He was sentenced to death based on the aggravating factor of future dangerousness. According to official records, Steve Edward Roach declined a special final meal. He ate the standard prison fare provided to all inmates on the evening of his execution. As he lay on the execution gurney, Roach offered a brief and religious final statement. He recited the 23rd Psalm from the Bible as his final statement in the death chamber. He also expressed love for his family, saying, "To my family and friends, there is only three words to say. I love you. May God bless each and every one of you." Following his execution, his attorney released a statement on Roach's behalf expressing that his death makes no sense and that the execution of children should stop. His execution took place just 3 days after that of another juvenile offender, Douglas Christopher Thomas. Lonnie Weeks Jr., March 16, 2000, lethal injection. He spent 7 years on death row for the murder of a state trooper during a routine traffic stop. Trooper Jose Cavazos was 50 years old and 12-year veteran of the Virginia State Police. The murder took place on February 24, 1993. Weeks was a passenger in a stolen Volkswagen Jetta driven by his uncle, Louis Dukes Jr., when Trooper Cavazos pulled them over for speeding on Interstate 95 near Dale City. When Cavazos asked Weeks to exit the vehicle, Weeks stepped out and fired 6 hollow-point bullets from a 9mm handgun at the officer. Two of the rounds struck Cavazos in the shoulder area, bypassing his bulletproof vest. He died at the scene within minutes. Weeks later testified that he panicked because he was on probation for a drug conviction and was riding in a stolen car. Weeks' case, Weeks versus Angelone, reached the Supreme Court concerning potential jury confusion regarding sentencing instructions. The court ultimately upheld the sufficiency of the instructions. While the victim's two adult children expressed forgiveness and sought clemency, the victim's widow supported the execution. Reports indicate Weeks spent his final hours with his minister. There are no records of his last meal. Weeks expressed remorse in his final statement, specifically thanking the victim's family members who had sought to spare his life. Michael David Clagett, July 6, 2000, electrocution. Clagett was executed for a quadruple murder committed during a robbery at a Virginia Beach tavern in 1994. On June 30, 1994, his 33rd birthday, Clagett and his girlfriend, Denise Rain Holsinger, robbed the Witch Duck Inn. Holsinger, a former waitress at the bar, had been fired and sought revenge against her former employer. While Holsinger emptied the cash register of approximately $400, Clagett held 4 people hostage at gunpoint. He then shot each of them once in the head at close range. Clagett confessed to the murders multiple times, including in a TV interview where he stated, "Yes, I shot every one of them." All 4 victims were inside the tavern at the time of the robbery. Lam Van Son was 41 years old and was the tavern owner and a Vietnamese immigrant who had fled to the U.S. after the fall of Saigon. His 5-year-old son was sleeping in a back room during the murders but was physically unharmed. Karen Sue Rounds was 31 years old and she was a newly hired waitress who had replaced Holsinger after she was fired. Wendell Parrish was 32 years old and he was the tavern's cook and handyman. Abdelaziz Gran, 34, was a regular patron who was born in Morocco. There are no records of Clagett's last meal. He was reported to have spent his final hours with his mother and his wife, whom he had married while on death row. Clagett was visibly emotional during his final moments. His last statement was a tearful apology to the victims' families. "I'm sorry. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I love my mother and I love my wife." Clagett famously chose the electric chair over lethal injection. He was the second inmate in Virginia to die by electrocution after the state began giving prisoners a choice of methods in 1995. His accomplice, Denise Holsinger, avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty, and she was sentenced to 5 life terms. Russell William Burkett, August 30, 2000, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for the exceptionally brutal double murder of a mother and her young daughter in their Virginia Beach home. On January 14, 1993, Burkett, a neighbor of the victims, broke into the home of Catherine Tafelsky, 32, while her husband, a Navy SEAL, was away on a mission. Burkett used a rusty 30-inch metal pry bar, an automotive tool, to bludgeon her to death while she was in her bed. He also committed a horrific essay on her body using that same metal tool. Ashley Tafelsky was 5 years old. Burkett used the same pry bar to crush the skull of the 5-year-old child as she lay in her own bed. Two other 3-year-old children in the house, Andrew Tafelsky Jr. and Chelsea Brothers, were also attacked. Andrew suffered a broken jaw and facial injuries, while Chelsea was severely bruised. Burkett confessed to the crimes 6 days after the murders. He pleaded guilty in 1994, famously applauding and thanking the judge when his death sentence was pronounced. The sentence was based on both vileness, due to the aggravated nature of the attacks, and future dangerousness. Burkett did not make a special final meal request. According to reports, he ate the standard prison meal provided that evening. His attorneys noted he saw the execution as his way of ending a life he hasn't wanted, as he had attempted suicide multiple times previously. Burkett had no final words. When asked if he had a final statement in the execution chamber, he simply shook his head and remained silent. Derek Rocco Barnaby, September 14, 2000, lethal injection. His case garnered massive international attention, particularly in Italy, due to his heritage, because of his persistent claims of innocence and high-profile appeals from the Vatican and the Italian government. Barnaby was sentenced to death for the 1993 essay and murder of Sarah Wisnowski, 17, a freshman at Old Dominion University, whom he had been dating. On September 22, 1993, Wisnowski's nude body was found floating in the Lafayette River in Norfolk. An autopsy revealed she had been manually strangled and struck at least 10 times in the head with a heavy, blunt object, such as a ball-peen hammer. Forensic evidence included Sarah's blood found in Barnaby's bedroom and on a surfboard he was storing. Shortly before his execution, DNA testing on the victim's fingernail clippings confirmed the presence of Barnaby's DNA, which Governor Jim Gilmore cited as definitive proof of his guilt. Barnaby fled Norfolk shortly before the body was discovered, and he was arrested 3 months later in Ohio, living under an assumed name. He ate his final meal at 5:06 p.m. on the day of his execution. However, at his specific request, prison officials declined to reveal the contents of the meal to the public. Barnaby maintained his innocence until the end, speaking to his mother and brother shortly before his death. His final statement in the death chamber was, "I am truly innocent of this crime. Eventually the truth will come out. I love you, Mom. I love you, Craig." He also recited a passage from Psalm 55, verse 18. "He hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for many were with me." Following the execution, the U.S. State Department issued a travel warning for Americans in Italy due to anonymous threats of retribution following the death of the Italian-American prisoner. Bobby Lee Ramdas, October 10, 2000, lethal injection. His case is legally famous for a U.S. Supreme Court battle regarding whether jurors should have been told he was ineligible for parole. Ramdas was sentenced to death for the 1992 robbery and murder of Mohammed Kayani, a 31-year-old Pakistani immigrant. The murder happened on September 2, 1992. Ramdas and 3 accomplices robbed a 7-Eleven in Alexandria, Virginia. Despite Kayani offering no resistance and handing over the money, Ramdas forced him to kneel behind the counter and shot him in the head at close range. Prosecutors emphasized that the killing was entirely unnecessary for the robbery to succeed. At the time, Ramdas was a member of a violent crew involved in a string of armed robberies in Northern Virginia. The central issue of his appeals was the Simons Rule. His lawyers argued that the jury should have been informed that Ramdas was ineligible for parole under Virginia's three strikes law. They believed that if the jury knew he would never be released, they would have opted for life in prison. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 against him, stating that because his third strike conviction hadn't been technically finalized by the judge at the exact moment of the sentencing, the rule didn't apply. Bobby Lee Ramdas requested that the details of his final meal not be released to the public. He spent his final hours meeting with his legal team and spiritual advisors. He chose not to make a final statement in the death chamber. When the warden asked if he had anything to say, he remained silent. He was pronounced dead at 9:09 p.m. Governor Jim Gilmore denied clemency, describing the murder as an execution-style killing of a defenseless victim. Christopher Cornelius Goins, December 6, 2000, lethal injection. On October 14, 1994, Goins entered the home of his 14-year-old ex-girlfriend, Tamika Jones, who was 7 months pregnant with his child. Upset by the pregnancy and believing Tamika's family was pressuring him, Goins opened fire with a 45 caliber Glock pistol, killing 5 family members and wounding 2 others. Each victim was shot at least once in the head at close range. James Nathaniel Randolph Jr., 35 years old, was Tamika's father. Daphne Jones, 29, was Tamika's mother. Nicole Jones, 9 years old, was Tamika's sister. David Jones, 4 years old, was Tamika's brother. Robert Jones, 3 years old, Tamika's brother as well. Goins specifically received the death penalty for Robert's murder, while receiving multiple life terms for the other 4 killings. Tamika Jones, who was 14 years old, was shot 9 times while shielding her younger sister. One bullet fatally struck her unborn baby, which died shortly after being removed from her uterus. Kenya Jones, 20 months, was Tamika's toddler sister, who was wounded but survived the attack. Goins did not request a special last meal and ate the standard prison fare provided that day. As he was brought into the execution chamber, Goins remarked, "Look, we've got an audience." His final formal statement was, "There is no God but Allah." Witnesses described Goins as showing no remorse, even dying with what appeared to be a smirk on his face. He had turned 27 years old just 1 day before his execution. Thomas Wayne Akers, March 1, 2001, lethal injection. He was on death row for the 1998 capital murder and robbery of Wesley Brand Smith, 24. On December 18, 1998, Akers and his cousin, Timothy Duane Martin, lured Smith into a rural area of Franklin County under the guise of a blind date. Once there, Akers choked Smith with a belt and beat him to death with an aluminum baseball bat. Akers dragged Smith's body to a nearby creek, continuing the beating until Smith's skull was fractured in several places. The pair reportedly killed Smith because Martin believed Smith had incriminated him in a traffic offense. After the murder, they stole Smith's car and wallet and fled to New York, where they were apprehended near the Canadian border. Akers was known as a volunteer because he actively sought the death penalty from the beginning of his trial. He told the judge that if he were not sentenced to death, he would kill again and it would be the judge's fault. Against the advice of his attorneys, Akers refused to present mitigating evidence about his traumatic childhood and mental health, and he eventually waived his right to appeal. Akers shared his final meal with his spiritual advisor, Pastor Larry Likens. The meal included pizza, French fries, and a banana pudding. Though almost inaudible, his final statement expressed religious peace and deep remorse. "I thank the Lord Jesus Christ for coming into my life. I love all of my family with all of my heart." Officials reported he also expressed a lot of remorse and hoped for the victim's family to forgive him. Christopher James Beck, October 18, 2001, lethal injection. He was executed for a premeditated triple murder and essay. Beck traveled from Philadelphia to Arlington to target his former boss, William Miller, who had recently fired him. On June 6, 1995, he broke into Miller's home and lay in wait. The victims included Florence Marie Marks, 54, Beck's cousin and the boarder at the home. She arrived first, and Beck shot her twice in the head before assaying her. William Miller, 52, he was Beck's former employer. When he returned, Beck shot him several times in the head. David Kaplan, 34, was another boarder. Beck shot him 7 times and stabbed him in the head when he found Kaplan dying on the floor. Following the murders, Beck stole cash, guns, and bicycles, and even waved to a neighbor while fleeing in Miller's car. There are no records of his last meal. He spent his final days visiting with family, legal counsel, and his spiritual advisor. Beck made a lengthy final statement expressing remorse for the fullness of his crimes. "I understand the sorrow and understand the fullness of my crimes. I understand there were more than 3 victims, that there are many that are not even born yet that became victims, the loss of security, of neighbors, and so forth. I'm sorry for everything I've done. The burden I carry is greater than any. This execution is nothing compared to what is on my shoulders." James Earl Patterson, March 13, 2002, lethal injection. Patterson was on death row for the 1987 capital murder of Joyce Aldridge, 54. The murder happened in 1987 when Patterson broke into Aldridge's home in Prince George County, where he stabbed her 15 times during a robbery. The case went unsolved for over a decade. Patterson only confessed to the crime in 1999 while already serving a life sentence for a separate 1987 murder, the essay and killing of a woman in Virginia Beach. He stated he confessed to clear his conscience and admitted he preferred execution over spending the rest of his life in prison. He requested a final meal that included pork chops, rice and gravy, green peas, apple pie, and fruit punch. As he lay on the execution gurney, Patterson offered a brief apology to the victim's family. I am sincerely sorry for what I have done. I hope this will bring some peace to the Ulrich family. He was pronounced dead at 9:07 p.m. His case was notable because he consistently fought his own lawyers' attempts to file appeals on his behalf, maintaining that he earned his punishment. Daniel Lee Zirkle, April 2, 2002, lethal injection. He was executed for the 1999 murders of his daughter and her half sister. He was notably a volunteer for execution, having pleaded guilty and consistently requested the death penalty while waiving all legal appeals. The murders occurred on August 2, 1999, shortly after Zirkle was released from jail for assaulting his estranged girlfriend, Barbara Jo Shiflett. He killed Jessica Leanne Shiflett, 14, who was Zirkle's former girlfriend's daughter. He broke into the happy home while she was babysitting and stabbed her in the neck with a serrated kitchen knife. Then he also killed Christina Marie Zirkle, who was 4 years old. She was his biological daughter. After killing Jessica, he abducted Christina and drove her to an overlook on Storybrook Trail in Page County. There, he stabbed her to death with the same knife before attempting to kill himself by slashing his own throat. Testimony indicated Zorkel acted out of revenge following the breakup of his relationship with Shiflett. A jail inmate testified that Zorkel vowed that if he couldn't have them, nobody else would. Zorkel declined to request a special final meal. He was served the standard prison fare provided to all inmates on the day of his execution. As he lay on the execution gurney, Zirkle looked pale and was shaking slightly, but he remained calm as he offered an apology and thanked his supporters. Following his execution, Zirkle's request to have his ashes scattered on the shared grave of his victims was denied by a judge after an injunction was filed due to the distress it caused the girls' mother. Walter Mikens Jr., June 12, 2002, lethal injection. He was executed for the essay and murder of a teenager. His case, Mikens versus Taylor, famously reached the U.S. Supreme Court due to a conflict of interest involving his defense attorney. Mikens was convicted of the capital murder of Timothy Jason Hall, 17, in Newport News, Virginia. On March 28, 1992, Mikens essayed and stabbed Hall 143 times beneath an abandoned building near the James River. A medical examiner testified that 25 of the wounds were potentially fatal and that Hall likely lived for over 30 minutes after the attack began. DNA from genetic material found at the scene matched Micon's, and Hall's Nike shoes were recovered from a witness who testified he bought them from Micon's for $5. After his conviction, it was discovered that Micon's led court-appointed attorney, Brian Saunders, had been representing the victim, Timothy Hall, on unrelated criminal charges at the time of Hall's death. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled 5-4 that while a conflict existed, it did not adversely affect Micon's defense enough to overturn the conviction. Mikens did not request a special last meal. Instead, he chose his final meal from the prison's regular menu served that day. He had baked chicken, rice, and carrots. As he was strapped to the gurney, he gave a lengthy statement focusing on forgiveness. He offered forgiveness to Governor Warner for his decision and asked for forgiveness from anyone he may have hurt, expressing sorrow for the pain caused. He was pronounced dead at 9:09 p.m., becoming the 86th person executed in Virginia since capital punishment was reinstated. Mir Ajmal Kasi, November 14, 2002, lethal injection. He was executed for the 1993 shootings outside CIA headquarters. On January 25, 1993, Cassie used a semi-automatic AK-47 assault rifle to open fire on vehicles stopped at a traffic light in Langley, Virginia, during the morning rush hour. He killed Frank Darling, 28, a covert operations officer, and Lansing Bennett, 66, an intelligence analyst. Darling was shot first and later received additional fatal wounds to the head after Cassie fired into other cars. He also wounded Nicholas Starr, Calvin Morgan, and Stephen Williams. Cassie admitted he carried out the attack to punish the U.S. government for its policies in the Middle East, specifically the bombing of Iraq and involvement in Muslim countries. He fled to Pakistan the day after the shootings and remained a fugitive for 4 years before being captured by the FBI in June 1997. For his final meal, served at approximately 5:15 p.m., Cassie requested fried rice, specifically with spices and egg, bananas, boiled eggs, and white bread. Cassie's final words, which he chanted softly in his native language until losing consciousness, were, "There is no God but Allah." Some witnesses also reported he added, "And Muhammad is his prophet." On his way into the execution chamber, he was observed waving two fingers in a victory sign to witnesses. He spent his final hours praying with a Muslim spiritual advisor. Earl Conrad Bramblett, April 9, 2003, electrocution. He was executed for the 1994 murders of a family of four in Vinton. He chose the electric chair over lethal injection as a form of protest against his conviction, which he maintained was a frame-up until his death. Bramblett was convicted of murdering the Hodges family on August 28, 1994. He was a close friend of the family and had been living with them. The victims were William Blaine Hodges, 41, Teresa Lynn Hodges, 37, Winter Ashley Hodges, 11, and Anna Michelle Hodges, 3. All of them suffered gunshot wounds or strangulation before their home was set on fire. Prosecutors claimed Bramblett was obsessed with the 11-year-old daughter and feared being reported for molestation. After the murders, Bramblett set the family home ablaze to destroy evidence. He was apprehended in South Carolina nearly 2 years later. He did not request a special final meal, and he was given the same dinner served to other inmates that evening, which included sloppy joes, boiled potatoes, corn, and chocolate cake. Strapped to the electric chair, Bramblett's final statement maintained his innocence. "I didn't murder the Hodges family. I've never murdered anybody. I'm going to my death with a clear conscience. I'm going to my death having had a great life because of my two great sons, Mike and Doug." In earlier correspondence, he referred to his execution as an assassination and preferred death to a life sentence. Bobby Wayne Swisher, July 22, 2003, lethal injection. He spent 5 years on death row for the 1997 abduction, essay, and murder of a 22-year-old mother. Swisher was convicted of capital murder in the death of Dawn McNeese Snyder, a florist and mother of a young son. The murder happened on February 5, 1997. Swisher abducted Snyder at knife point from the flower shop she co-owned in Stewart's Draft while she was working late to fill Valentine's Day orders. He forced her to a field near the South River where he essayed and assaulted her. He then used a butcher knife to slash her face and slit her throat. Swisher threw Snyder into the river while she was still alive. He walked along the bank watching her struggle and asking, "Are you dead yet?" Snyder managed to crawl back onto the shore but died in the field. Her body was discovered 16 days later. According to official records, Swisher did not request a special last meal. He reportedly ate the standard prison fare provided that evening. As he lay on the execution gurney, Swisher appeared to smile and made a brief religious final statement. "I hope you can all find the same peace in Jesus Christ as I have." Brian Lee Cherrix, March 18, 2004, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for a premeditated capital murder and essay that remained unsolved for over 3 years. The victim was Tessa Van Hart, 23, a mother of two who worked as a pizza delivery driver. The murder happened on January 27, 1994. Cherrix lured Van Hart to a vacant summer home by placing a phony pizza order. Upon her arrival, he abducted her at gunpoint. He forced her to the back of the house where he sodomized her. He then shot her twice in the head at close range to prevent her from reporting the attack. Van Hart's body was found in the back seat of her car several hours later. The undelivered pizza remained in the front seat. The case went cold until 1996 when Cherrix, while in jail for an unrelated shooting of his half-brother, offered to trade information for leniency. He initially tried to blame the murder on a deceased cousin, but eventually confessed to the crime himself twice, even leading police to the location of the murder weapon in a nearby creek. There are no records of his last meal. When asked in the death chamber if he wished to make a last statement, he replied, "No, I do not." He entered the death chamber wearing a light blue shirt and dark blue pants, appearing calm. He had given up his final federal appeals and did not seek clemency, stating he did not want to spend the rest of his life in prison. He also successfully requested that no autopsy be performed on his body due to his religious beliefs. Dennis Mitchell Orb, March 31, 2004, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for a murder committed during a 10-day violent crime spree in early 1998. Orb was on death row for the capital murder of Richard Sterling Burnett, 39. The murder occurred on January 24, 1998. At 3:38 a.m., Orb entered an Exxon convenience store in York County, pointed a revolver at Burnett, and shot him in the chest after Burnett opened the cash register drawer. Orb then walked around the counter, took the money, and fled. The entire unprovoked shooting was captured on the store's video surveillance system. The murder occurred during a rampage that included breaking into homes, shooting a woman in the leg, and robbing 3 cleaning women, whom he then locked in a closet and nailed shut with plywood. He was captured after a high-speed chase in Richmond on January 31, 1998. He requested a final meal consisting of fried chicken breasts, French fries, green beans, and a plain chocolate brownie. He declined to make a formal final statement in the death chamber. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply said no. Just before the execution, he kissed a cross held up to him by his spiritual advisor. Mark Wesley Bailey, July 22, 2004, lethal injection. He was on death row for the 1998 murders of his wife and 2-year-old son in Hampton. The murders occurred on September 10, 1998. Early that morning, Bailey shot his 22-year-old wife, Catherine Katie Bailey, 3 times in the head as she slept. Upon hearing his young son, Nathan Mark Bailey, 2 years old, waking up in the next room, Bailey went into the bedroom and shot him twice in the head as the child was climbing out of bed. Before leaving for work as a Navy machinist's mate, Bailey cut a window screen and the home's telephone line to simulate an intruder. He told coworkers that morning that his wife had been receiving threatening calls and was likely abducted. Bailey later confessed, claiming his marriage was failing and he believed his wife, who was also his first cousin once removed, was being unfaithful. He stated he killed his son because he did not want the child to find his mother's body. According to prison records, Bailey requested that the details of his final meal not be made public. When the warden asked if he had a final statement in the death chamber, Bailey spoke in a clear, strong voice. No, thank you. He was pronounced dead at 9:06 p.m. at the Greensville Correctional Center. His defense team had unsuccessfully argued for clemency based on his history of bipolar disorder and military service as a Gulf War veteran. James Bryant Hudson, August 18, 2004, lethal injection. He spent roughly 16 months on death row after pleading guilty to the premeditated murders of 3 neighbors over a long-standing property dispute. The murders took place on July 3, 2002, in Halifax County, Virginia. Walter Stanley Cole, 56, and Thomas Wesley Cole, 64, were the first to be killed. Hudson used a 12-gauge shotgun to shoot both brothers at close range while they were in or near a truck on the shared driveway. Stanley was shot in the head while sitting in the truck, and Wesley tried to flee, but he was shot in the back of the head while lying in a ditch. After killing the brothers, Hudson drove to Wesley Cole's house next door and found his wife, Patsy Ayers Cole, 64, working in her garden. When she asked, "What are you doing?" Hudson shot her. He was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder for the brothers and 1 count of first-degree murder for Mrs. Cole. He waived all legal appeals and refused to seek clemency from Governor Mark Warner. Hudson's final meal was served at 4:45 p.m. on the day of his execution and consisted of a cheeseburger, French fries with ketchup, a tossed salad. He also wanted saltines. When Warden George Hinkle asked if he had a final statement in the death chamber, Hudson replied in a clear voice, "No, sir." He was pronounced dead at 9:07 p.m. Witnesses' accounts noted he appeared calm and showed no emotion during his final hours, which he spent without meeting any family or attorneys. James Edward Reed, September 9, 2004, lethal injection. At 58 years old, he was on death row for a brutal 1996 murder characterized by the trial court as outrageously vile. Reed was convicted of the capital murder, attempted essay, and attempted robbery of Annie Lester, 87, a resident of Christiansburg for whom he had occasionally performed odd jobs. The murder took place on October 12, 1996. While in a drunken state, Reed attacked the elderly woman in her kitchen. He beat her in the head with a can of condensed milk, crushed a bone in her throat through strangulation, and stabbed her 22 times with a pair of scissors. Reed dragged her body from the kitchen to her bedroom, removed her clothing, and ransacked the room. He was apprehended later that day, covered in blood, near the victim's home. Forensic evidence included blood on his jacket matching Lester's DNA and his bloody fingerprints on her bedroom telephone. His defense team highlighted that Reed suffered from brain damage due to a 1968 car accident, a resulting seizure disorder, and chronic alcoholism. Experts argued these conditions caused blackout periods where he lacked control. His original trial attorney, Peter Theodore, was later forced to surrender his law license for lying about his experience and his handling of Reed's defense. James Edward Reed did not request a special final meal. As he lay on the execution gurney, where it took technicians 12 minutes to find a suitable vein due to his history of alcohol abuse, Reed offered a final statement focused on forgiveness. I forgive you for what you are doing, but I don't forgive you for what you think or what you feel or what you say or what you do. I forgive you because God has forgiven me. Dexter Lee Vinson, April 27, 2006, lethal injection. At the age of 43, he was the 95th person put to death in Virginia since the reinstatement of capital punishment. Vinson was sentenced to death for the 1997 capital murder of his ex-girlfriend Angela Felton, 25, a mother of three. The murder took place on May 19, 1997. Felton had separated from Vinson 3 weeks earlier, but returned to their former home to retrieve mail. Vinson rammed her car with his own to force her to stop. He abducted her and took her to a nearby abandoned house in Portsmouth. Inside the vacant house, Vinson subjected Felton to a savage essay and torture. He beat and choked her with a rope, slammed her head against a car door, and eventually killed her by inflicting multiple deep cuts to her forearms, which caused her to bleed to death. Her nude, mutilated body was found the following day wrapped in a blanket. In addition to the fatal forearm wounds, she suffered significant private parts injuries and knife wounds to her neck, shoulders, and torso. Earlier on the day of his execution, Vincent specifically requested that the details of his final meal not be released to the public. He offered no final statement. When asked by a prison official in the execution chamber if he had any last words, he whispered no and shook his head. He was pronounced dead at 9:15 p.m. His case was legally significant as it was the first clemency request of Governor Timothy Kane's term. Kane, though personally opposed to capital punishment, declined to intervene, citing no reason to doubt Vincent's guilt. Brandon Wayne Hendrick, July 20, 2006, electrocution. Hendrick was executed at 27 years old. He became the first person in the U.S. to be put to death by the electric chair in over 2 years, having chosen it over lethal injection due to a fear of complications with the drug cocktail. Hendrick was sentenced to death for the 1997 capital murder of Lisa Yvonne Kreider, 23, a mother of a 5-year-old son. On May 10, 1997, Hendrick and an accomplice, Trevor Jones, abducted Kreider from a Lynchburg street. After bringing her to Jones' apartment, they robbed her of $50 at gunpoint and bound her with handcuffs and duct tape. The men drove her to a remote bank of the James River, and during the drive, Hendrick essayed and surprised her. Near daybreak, he delivered a fatal shotgun blast to her face. Her body was found with her head wrapped in duct tape and hands shackled, making her face nearly unrecognizable. Trevor Jones received a life sentence for his role. Hendrick's final meal included pizza with cheese, sausage, and hamburger, French fries with ketchup, bacon, chocolate cake, and apple pie. As he was strapped into the electric chair, Hendrick offered a religious final statement. I pray for everybody that believes in Jesus Christ in heaven, and I pray for the people that are unsaved that they will accept Christ because they know not what they do and will accept Christ one day. I'm ready to go and be free. Hendrick's defense team had sought clemency, citing his borderline IQ of 76 and claims of inadequate legal representation, but Governor Tim Kaine declined to intervene. Michael William Lenz, July 27, 2006, lethal injection. He was sentenced to death for the murder of a fellow inmate at a Virginia state prison. Lance was convicted of the willful and premeditated capital murder of 41-year-old Brent Parker on January 16, 2000. At the time of the offense, Lance was an inmate at the Augusta Correctional Center serving a 29-year sentence for burglary and weapon possession. During a meeting of a Nordic pagan religious group known as the Ironwood Kindred, Lenz and another inmate, Jeffrey Remington, attacked Parker at the foot of a makeshift altar. They stabbed Parker a total of 68 times. Prison guards witnessed the attack through a window, but Lenz and his accomplice ignored orders to stop and continued stabbing Parker until backup arrived. Lenz testified that he killed Parker for religious reasons, claiming that Parker had not been taking the Asatru religion seriously and needed to be punished to protect the honor of the gods. Lenz also claimed he felt threatened by Parker, who had allegedly threatened his life previously. He declined to request a special last meal. He met with his mother and two uncles for 2 hours on the afternoon of his execution, but otherwise made no special requests. He declined to make a final statement. When asked by the warden in the execution chamber if he had any last words, he simply gave a slight shake of his head, indicating no. His accomplice, Jeffrey Remington, was also sentenced to death, but he committed suicide on death row in 2004. John Yancey Schmidt, November 9, 2006, lethal injection. Schmidt was convicted for the 1999 murder of Earl Shelton Dunning, 39, a security guard and retired Army veteran. On February 17, 1999, Schmidt entered the Nations Bank in Chesterfield County wearing sunglasses and a bulky jacket. Dunning, who had been hired following a robbery at the same bank a month prior, confronted Schmidt. Schmidt shot Dunning twice, with the fatal bullet striking his chest. After shooting Dunning, Schmidt brandished his weapon at tellers, demanding money and threatening to kill everyone. He fled with nearly $36,000 in cash. Only a month earlier, Schmidt and an accomplice had robbed the same bank of more than $60,000 while armed with a sawed-off shotgun. Schmidt requested a final meal consisting of cheese pizza, a cheese omelette with sausage, green peppers and onions, and white cake with white icing. As he lay on the execution gurney, Schmidt remained stoic and spoke in a matter-of-fact tone. When asked for a final statement, his last words were, "Come on with it." He was pronounced dead at 9:14 p.m. after the U.S. Supreme Court and Governor Timothy Kaine declined final requests for a stay. Kevin Green, May 27, 2008, lethal injection. His execution was the first in Virginia after a nearly 2-year hiatus following a nationwide stay on lethal injections. Green was sentenced to death for a violent armed robbery on August 21, 1998, in Brunswick County, Virginia. Patricia Vaughan was 53 years old and the co-owner of Lawrence's Grocery. Green shot her 4 times during the robbery and she died at the scene. Lawrence Vaughan was 68 years old and was Patricia's husband. Green shot him twice, but he survived and later testified against Green at trial. Green and his 16-year-old nephew, David Green, stole approximately $9,000 in cash and Lawrence's handgun. They spent most of the stolen money on Mary Jane, clothes, and prostitutes before being arrested several days later. Green requested a special final meal, but at his specific request, prison officials declined to disclose the contents to the public. When asked if he had any final statement in the execution chamber, Green replied, "No, I don't got nothing to say." His case was notable for intense debates over his mental capacity. His lawyers sought clemency from Governor Tim Kaine, arguing Green had an IQ of 65 and that he was intellectually disabled. While a federal judge found his IQ was below 70, the courts ultimately ruled he was not intellectually disabled because he functioned well enough in daily life to maintain a job and a driver's license. Robert Stacy Yarbrough, June 25, 2008, lethal injection. His death marked a significant milestone as the 100th execution in Virginia since the death penalty was reinstated. Yarbrough received the death penalty for the capital murder and robbery of Cyril Hugh Hamby, 77, a longtime Mecklenburg County store owner. The murder took place on May 8, 1997. Yarbrough, 18 years old, and the 17-year-old accomplice, Dominic Rainey, planned to rob Hamby's store. They bound Hamby and Yarbrough assaulted him, demanding to know the location of his guns. Despite Hamby's pleas, Yarbrough used the pocket knife to repeatedly cut his neck, causing deep wounds that led to his death. The pair stole around $100 and other items. Yarbrough was linked to the crime through his accomplice's testimony and DNA on his sneakers. He requested fried chicken tenders and cheese pizza for his last meal. His last statement was, "Tell my kids I love them and let's get it over with. Make people happy, help celebrate the murder." The execution process took about 10 minutes due to difficulty in placing an intravenous line. Kent Jermaine Jackson, July 10, 2008, lethal injection. Jackson was convicted of the capital murder, robbery, and burglary of his elderly neighbor, Beulah May Kaiser, 79, in Newport News, Virginia. The murder took place on April 16, 2000. Jackson and his roommate, Joseph Dorset, entered Kaiser's apartment across the hall to rob her. Kaiser was beaten, kicked, and stabbed. The medical examiner testified she died from a combination of a stab wound to her jugular vein, a fractured skull, and asphyxia. Most notably, her own walking cane was driven into her mouth and throat with such force that it broke her jaw and teeth, contributing to her death. She was also essayed during the attack. While Jackson received the death penalty, his accomplice Dorset was sentenced to 135 years in prison. Jackson initially ordered a special last meal consisting of chicken stir fry with rice, a tossed salad, cookies, an orange drink, and strawberry ice cream. However, just before the execution, he reportedly told jail officials he did not want it and declined to eat it. Jackson remained defiant until the end. As he was strapped to the gurney, his final words were, "You all can't kill me. I'm the king. Remember me like you remember Jesus. I'll be back." Christopher Scott Emmett, July 24, 2008, lethal injection. Emmett was sentenced to death for the 2001 capital murder and robbery of his co-worker, John Fenton Langley, 43 years old. On April 26, 2001, Emmett and Langley were sharing a motel room in Danville as part of an out-of-town roofing crew. After an evening of grilling food and playing cards, Emmett beat a sleeping Langley to death with a motel room lamp. Emmett admitted in a taped confession that he killed Langley to steal his wallet, which contained approximately $100, to buy crack cocaine. Emmett requested a specific final meal, but at his own request, prison officials kept his choices private. His last statement was characterized by a mix of affection for his family and a sarcastic jab at political and correctional officials. "Tell my family and friends I love them. Tell the governor he just lost my vote. Y'all hurry this along, I'm dying to get out of here." His execution was legally significant as he had unsuccessfully challenged Virginia's three-drug lethal injection protocol, arguing it was unconstitutional, a claim the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals rejected just before his death. Edward Nathaniel Bell, February 19, 2009, lethal injection. He was executed for the capital murder of a police officer. Bell was sentenced to death for the 1999 killing of Sergeant Ricky Lee Timbrook, 32, a member of the Winchester Police Department. On the evening of October 29, 1999, Sergeant Timbrook was assisting probation officers with home visits when he pursued Bell during a foot chase through a dark alley. As Timbrook attempted to climb a fence, Bell turned and fired a single shot from a .38 caliber revolver, striking the officer in the forehead and killing him instantly. Prosecutors established that Bell, a known drug dealer, held a grudge against Timbrook, who had arrested him twice before, once in 1997 for carrying a concealed weapon. Witnesses testified that Bell had previously stated he would shoot Timbrook in the head because he knew officers wore bulletproof vests. Bell did not request a special last meal. His attorney stated that Bell remained hopeful for a pardon until the very end. He was served the standard prison dinner provided to other inmates, which on that evening consisted of a cheese sandwich. Bell maintained his innocence until his final moments and was reportedly forcibly carried into the execution chamber by 6 guards after resisting. His last words, directed toward the victim's family, were, "To the Timbrook family, you definitely have the wrong person. The truth will come out one day. This here killing me, there's no justice about it." John Allen Muhammad, November 10, 2009, lethal injection. Notoriously known as the DC Sniper or the Beltway Sniper, he was on death row in Virginia for his role as the mastermind behind the 3-week series of random shootings that terrorized the Washington metropolitan area in October 2002. Muhammad and his teenage accomplice, Lee Boyd Malvo, carried out a spree across Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., killing 10 people and wounding 3 others. They were also linked to shootings in several other states, including Louisiana, Alabama, and Arizona. He was specifically sentenced to death in Virginia for the murder of Dean Harold Myers, a 53-year-old civil engineer shot while pumping gas at a station in Manassas. The 10 victims killed during the October 2002 Beltway spree were James Martin, 55, grocery store parking lot; James Buchanan, 39, landscaping and auto dealership; Prem Kumar Walekar, 54, gas station; Sarah Ramos, 34, outside the post office; Lori Ann Lewis Rivera, 25, gas station; Pascal Charlotte, 72, standing on a street; Dean Harold Myers, 53, gas station; Kenneth Bridges, 53, gas station; Linda Franklin, 47, outside Home Depot; and Conrad Johnson, 35, on a commuter bus. Muhammad accepted the final meal request, which was served several hours before his execution. He had chicken with red sauce and cake. Though he initially asked for the details of his meal to be kept private, his attorneys later shared the menu with the media. He offered no final statement. When asked by the warden if he had any last words, he remained stoic and silent, refusing to acknowledge the question. He was pronounced dead at 9:11 p.m. His accomplice, Lee Boyd Malvo, was 17 at the time of the crimes and was sentenced to life without parole, later commuted in Virginia to life with the possibility of parole due to changes in juvenile sentencing laws. Larry Bill Elliott, November 17, 2009, electrocution. He was executed for the double murder of a young couple. A former Army counterintelligence officer, he was the first U.S. inmate to die by the electric chair in over a year. Elliott was convicted of the January 2, 2001 murders of Dana Trell, 25, and Robert Finch, 30, in their Woodbridge townhouse. Finch was shot multiple times, and Trell was fatally shot after being pistol whipped with her two young sons upstairs. Prosecutors argued that Elliott, who had spent a large sum of money on a woman named Rebecca Gregg, was obsessed with her and killed Finch to help resolve a custody dispute she had with him. Although no murder weapon was found, Elliott's DNA was discovered at the scene, and the witness saw someone matching his description nearby. He spent his last hours with family, lawyers, and a spiritual advisor. He did not make a final statement in the death chamber. However, he provided a written statement to his attorneys to read afterward, in which he maintained his innocence. In the statement, he expressed sorrow for the victims' deaths and suggested his execution might highlight issues with the judicial system. He also hoped his case would contribute to the abolition of the death penalty. Paul Warner Powell, March 18, 2010, electrocution. Powell, a self-avowed white supremacist, committed the crimes for which he landed on death row on January 29, 1999. One of his victims was Stacy Lynn Reed, 16. Powell went to the Reed home to confront Stacy for dating a black man. After she rejected his sexual advances, he pinned her down, attempted to assay her, and stabbed her in the heart. He then stomped on her neck until she stopped breathing. After killing Stacy, Powell stayed in the house, drank iced tea, and waited for Christy Reed, 14, to return from school. Upon her arrival, he dragged her to the basement, essayed her, strangled her into unconsciousness, and slit her throat with a knife. Christie survived and was able to identify Powell to police, eventually testifying against him at trial. Powell was originally convicted and sentenced to death, but the Virginia Supreme Court overturned the verdict in 2001, ruling the evidence was insufficient to prove he attempted to assay Stacy, a necessary element for a capital murder charge at the time. Believing the principle of double jeopardy protected him from being tried again, Powell wrote a profanity-laced taunting letter to the prosecutor, admitting in graphic detail that he had attempted to assay Stacy. Prosecutors used this new evidence to re-indict him for capital murder. He was convicted and sentenced to death a second time in 2003. The records of his final meal have been kept private at his request. He reportedly spent his final day meeting with family and his attorneys. He offered no final statement in the execution chamber. When asked if he had any last words, he remained silent and stared at the ceiling until the procedure began. However, the day before his execution, he spoke with the victim's family by phone for over an hour, during which he reportedly acknowledged the crime was senseless and pointless and apologized for his actions. Derek DeMorris Walker, May 20, 2010, lethal injection. He was 37 years old at the time of his execution. He was sentenced to death for the capital murders of two Richmond men, both of whom were shot in front of family members. Stanley Beal was 36 years old. On November 22, 1996, Walker kicked in the door of Beal's apartment, accused him of coming to his door looking for him, though Beal did not know Walker, and shot him 3 times in front of his partner and 3 children. Clarence Elwood Threat was 34. On June 19, 1997, Walker forced his way into Threat's home and shot him 7 times while he and his girlfriend were sleeping. The motive was reportedly that Threat's girlfriend had previously turned Walker down for a date. Derek Walker did not request a special final meal. He was served the standard prison fare provided to other inmates on the day of his execution. Walker's final words were a criticism of the execution process, specifically the delay in setting up the intravenous lines. As he lay on the gurney, he stated, "I don't think y'all done this right. Took y'all too long to hook it up. You can print that. That's it." Officials confirmed there had been a difficulty in placing one of the two IV lines, which caused a slight delay before the first chemical was administered. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis, September 23, 2010, lethal injection. She was the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century and remains the last woman to have been executed in the state. Lewis pleaded guilty to orchestrating a murder for hire plot in October 2002 to collect $250,000 in life insurance proceeds. The victims were her husband, Julian Clifton Lewis Jr., 51, and her stepson, Charles Lewis, 25, a U.S. Army reservist. Lewis hired 2 men, Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, whom she enticed with relations and promises of money. She left the door of their mobile home unlocked, allowing the gunmen to enter and shoot the sleeping victims with multiple shotgun blasts while she waited in the kitchen. As her husband lay dying, she took his wallet and split the money with the gunman, then waited 45 minutes before calling emergency services. The judge dubbed her the head of this serpent for her central role in the plot, whereas the actual triggerman received life sentences. For her final meal, served around 5 p.m., Lewis requested 2 fried chicken breasts, sweet peas with butter, a Dr. Pepper soft drink, apple pie, or German chocolate cake for dessert. Shortly before her execution, Lewis asked if her stepdaughter, Katie Clifton, was present. Her final words were, "I just want Katie to know that I love you, and I'm very sorry." Lewis's case drew international attention due to her borderline intellectual disability, with an estimated IQ of 72, which supporters argued should have spared her from the death penalty. Jerry Terrell Jackson, August 18, 2011, lethal injection. He was 30 years old at the time of his execution and was the 109th person put to death in Virginia since 1976. Jackson was on death row for the 2001 capital murder of Ruth Phillips, 88, a widowed seamstress. The murder took place on August 26, 2001. Jackson broke into Phillips' apartment in Williamsburg with the intent to steal. When Phillips woke up and found him rummaging through her purse, she offered him anything if he would leave. Instead of leaving, Jackson held a pillow over her face and essayed her. She died of asphyxia. Jackson fled the scene in Phillips' car with $60 he stole from her purse, which he later used to buy Mary Jane. Investigators linked Jackson to the crime through a fingerprint on a paper in her purse and DNA from hairs found on her body. He was convicted of burglary, robbery, essay, larceny, and 2 counts of capital murder. Jackson requested a final meal but asked that the specific details remain confidential. According to news reports, he spent his last day visiting with family members, his spiritual advisor, and his attorneys. When asked for a final statement in the execution chamber, Jackson chose to say nothing. He reportedly shook his head no and whispered the word softly as he was being prepared for the procedure. While waiting for the lethal drugs to be administered, witnesses noted he appeared calm and occasionally tapped his right foot. Jackson was the first inmate in Virginia executed using a revised three-drug cocktail that replaced sodium thiopental with pentobarbital due to a nationwide shortage of the former drug. His appeals focused on claims that his original trial lawyers failed to present evidence of severe and pervasive childhood abuse he suffered, which some judges believed could have led to a life sentence instead of death. Robert Charles Gleason Jr., January 16, 2013, electrocution. He was an execution volunteer who sought the death penalty to stop himself from killing again while in prison. Gleason was convicted of three separate murders, two of which occurred while he was already incarcerated. Michael Kent Jamerson, 2007. Gleason shot Jamerson to cover up his involvement in a drug gang. He was sentenced to life without parole for this crime in 2008. Harvey Gray Watson Jr., 2009. Frustrated that prison officials would not move a mentally disturbed cellmate, Gleason hogtied, beat, and strangled the 63-year-old Watson. He taunted Watson by stuffing a urine-soaked sponge into his face before killing him. Aaron Alexander Cooper, 2010. While awaiting sentencing for Watson's murder, Gleason strangled the 26-year-old Cooper through a wire fence in a prison yard. He reportedly tricked Cooper into trying on a religious necklace, a ligature, to get him close enough to the fence. Gleason requested that the details of his final meal be kept confidential. Reports indicate he ordered a meal from the standard prison menu, but asked that its specific contents not be revealed to the public. Gleason provided a defiant final statement that included an Irish Gaelic insult and a reference to the execution procedure. Well, I hope Percy ain't going to forget to wet the sponge. Put me on the highway to Jackson and call my Irish buddies. Pog mo thoin, God bless. The phrase Pog mo thoin translates from Irish as kiss my. He chose the electric chair over lethal injection because he did not want to go out lying down and believed it would be faster. He was the last person to be executed by electrocution in Virginia. Alfredo Rolando Prieto, October 1st, 2015, lethal injection. He was a prolific serial killer linked to 9 murders across Virginia and California. Prieto was on Virginia's death row for the 1988 cold case murders of a young couple. He was already serving a death sentence in California when DNA evidence linked him to several Virginia slayings. In 2010, Prieto was sentenced to death for the 1988 essay and murder of Rachel Raver, 22, and the murder of her boyfriend, Warren Fulton, 22. Their bodies were found in a field near Reston shortly after they were last seen at a Washington, D.C. night spot. He was initially sentenced to death in 1992 for the 1990 essay and murder of Yvette Woodruff, 15, in Ontario, California. DNA and ballistics evidence linked him to 6 additional murders, including the 1988 killing of Veronica Lynn Jefferson in Arlington and the 1989 murder of Manuel Sarmeno in Prince William County. According to official reports, Prieto did not request a special last meal. He was served a standard prison meal provided by the Greensville Correctional Center. As he was prepared for lethal injection, Prieto thanked his legal team, supporters, and family before growing impatient with the process. I would like to say thanks to all my lawyers, all my supporters, and all my family members. Get this over with. His execution was legally controversial because his attorneys argued he was intellectually disabled, which would make his execution unconstitutional. However, Virginia courts ruled that his high level of social adaptation and literacy disqualified him from this exemption. Ricky Javon Gray, January 18, 2017, lethal injection. He was the second to last person executed in Virginia before the state abolished the death penalty in 2021. Gray was on death row for a violent 2006 spree in Richmond, during which he and his nephew, Ray Dandridge, murdered 7 people in 6 days. The Harvey family. On New Year's Day 2006, the pair spotted an open front door at the home of Brian, 49, and Catherine, 39, Harvey. They tied up the couple and their 2 daughters, Stella, 9, and Ruby, 4, in the basement. Gray brutally beat them with a hammer and slit their throats before setting the house on fire. The Baskerville Tucker family. 5 days later, Gray murdered his accomplice's girlfriend, Ashley Baskerville, 21, along with her mother, Mary Baskerville Tucker, 46, and stepfather, Purcell Tucker, 55. All 3 were found bound and gagged. They died from suffocation. Gray also confessed to the 2005 bludgeoning murder of his wife, Treva Terrell Gray, in Pennsylvania. Ricky Gray declined his final meal and chose not to request any special food. When asked for a final statement in the execution chamber, Gray offered only a single word: nope. Although silent at the end, Gray had issued a recorded public apology days earlier, stating he had robbed the Harvey family of a lifelong supply of joy. His defense had unsuccessfully sought clemency from Governor Terry McAuliffe by citing a history of severe childhood abuse and PCP-induced psychosis. William Charles Morva, July 6, 2017, lethal injection. Morva was convicted of 3 counts of capital murder stemming from a violent escape while he was awaiting trial on attempted robbery charges. Derek McFarland, 32. On August 20, 2006, Morva was taken from jail to Montgomery Regional Hospital for treatment. After using a bathroom, he overpowered a deputy using a metal toilet paper holder, stole the deputy's gun, and shot McFarland, an unarmed hospital security guard, in the face at point-blank range. Corporal Eric Sutpen, 40. The following morning, during a massive manhunt near the Virginia Tech campus, Morva encountered Sutpen, a Montgomery County Sheriff's corporal, on a trail and shot him in the back of the head. His case was highly controversial due to his diagnosis of delusional disorder, a psychotic condition similar to schizophrenia. His attorneys argued his crimes were driven by delusions, including a belief that he had life-threatening medical issues and was being conspired against by authorities. Clemency was sought by mental health advocates, the European Union, and even Rachel Sutpen, the daughter of the slain corporal, but Governor Terry McAuliffe declined to intervene. Official reports do not specify a unique special final meal request for Morva. In the hours before his death, he was reported to be very nervous, with witnesses observing his collar shaking. William Morva offered no final words in the execution chamber. When the warden asked if he had any last statement, he responded simply with no. Media witnesses reported that while he was strapped to the gurney, his lips appeared to move as if he were whispering to himself, but his voice was not picked up by the microphone. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.